I spent 22 grueling months, single-handedly restoring an ancient fieldstone house, only for my son to glance at it and sneer, "It looks like a stone tomb, not our style." But when his business collapsed, he demanded the deed as collateral. I refused and sold it for $1.1 million. Now he's suing me using his late mother's name to seize the cash. He forgets I found her secret notebook hidden inside the walls, a counterstrike that will shatter his lawsuit completely. This story starts quietly, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me what the weather is like where you are. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs today. Quick note, some details are adjusted for storytelling, but the lesson at the heart of this is what I hope stays with you. I dedicated nearly 2 years of my life to breathing new life into a ruined, late 19th century structure tucked away in the Berkshires. Every single boulder was reset, and every floorboard was meticulously scraped and finished by hand. Yet the painful aftermath of that massive undertaking taught me infinitely more about family legacy than 3 full decades of professional masonry ever could. My name is Arthur Vance. At 60 years old, my physical frame bears the stubborn, calloused markers of a lifetime spent working as a master bricklayer and carpenter across Berkshire County, Massachusetts. My hands possess an intimate instinctual familiarity with the heavy fieldstone, rough slate, and dense timber native to these rugged New England hills. 3 winters ago, the anchor of my existence slipped away. My beloved wife, Clara, passed away from an aggressive bout of pancreatic cancer. It was a mere 9 weeks from her initial diagnosis to that quiet, devastating morning when the room grew cold and I held her frail hand for the absolute last time. Her personal journal still rests on our heavy oak kitchen table, completely undisturbed. It sits in the exact position she left it the evening prior to that fateful hospital visit, her favorite fountain pen still nestled within the paper folds. I haven't mustered the courage to move it, let alone open the pages to discover what casual thoughts she committed to paper during those final ordinary hours before our world fractured. On a freezing January morning in 2023, I stood out on my back porch, nursing a steaming mug of black coffee. My gaze drifted across our frozen 8-acre plot toward the collapsed skeletal remains of an old fieldstone homestead. Clara and I had purchased this specific acreage back in 1987 primarily because of that ruin. She possessed a vivid vision for it, frequently insisting that the neglected building possessed phenomenal underlying structure. She firmly believed that unique historical spaces, especially an 1,800-square-foot monument to forgotten craftsmanship, deserved to endure for another century if someone cared enough to execute the restoration correctly. Once her vibrant presence was gone, the domestic silence within our primary residence transformed into a suffocating physical weight. I would sit motionless at the table, trapped in an absolute vacuum. There was no gentle humming from the kitchen as she brewed morning tea, no familiar rustle of turning pages from her favorite armchair. There was only a heavy, crushing stillness that mirrored the winter snow accumulating on an old roof that you know can barely withstand the season. Staring across the snowy field at that pile of forgotten stones, an epiphany struck me. I didn't need to succumb to grief. I knew precisely how to fix this broken structure. An exceptional stonemason doesn't merely pile rocks on top of one another, he interprets them. He calculates their internal weight, reads the direction of the grain, feels the temperature, and understands exactly how moisture has traveled through the material over 100 brutal winters. It is a highly specialized literacy, akin to studying a person's expressions across a dimly lit dinner table and detecting a hidden sorrow before a single word is uttered. My calloused fingers comprehend stone the exact way a seasoned pianist registers ivory keys. The intuition takes hold long before the eye processes the form. I deliberately refrained from involving outside help or soliciting commercial bids. I quietly secured the standard municipal permits, myself keeping the paperwork filed away in my workshop, and simply grabbed my tools to begin hauling away decades of accumulated rot and debris. From the bitter depths of January through the thawing mud of March, I labored tirelessly amidst freezing downpours, biting winds, and treacherous slush. I arrived at the site every morning before the thick valley mist lifted off the majestic tectonic range, and I refused to quit until the final sliver of evening twilight abandoned the sky. The original shifting perimeter walls had to be systematically dismantled and completely rebuilt, using traditional dry stone techniques combined with an authentic lime mortar mix. I strictly adhered to the rigorous 1890s methodology, entirely rejecting the cheap, chemical-laden shortcuts that defined contemporary construction. Every single stone was manually selected based on how perfectly it locked into its surrounding piers, ensuring the completed mass would reliably support immense weight for another 100 years. When April arrived, I managed to secure a stash of rare reclaimed chestnut flooring from an old demolition site over in Lenox. These massive planks had originally served as ceiling joists in a grand historic hotel constructed the very same year as this homestead. The ancient timber seemed to retain a memory of its structural purpose, responding beautifully to my tools. What options truly remain for a man when his lifelong partner vanishes, leaving behind a home that offers nothing but an echoing absence? The answer is simple. You channel that grief into creating an entirely different structure. I personally milled all the custom kitchen cabinetry from a massive storm-fallen maple tree salvaged from my own woodlands. I carefully sliced the dense logs using the antique bandsaw inside my workshop, the exact machine Clara used to playfully complain was far too loud, yet never permitted me to replace it, because she recognized the profound peace it brought to my soul. The structural restoration also required me to rebuild 2 massive chimneys stone by painstaking stone. The primary fireplace, a monumental fieldstone hearth designed to dominate the central living room, demanded 6 entire weeks of continuous focused labor. It was a grueling cycle of selecting individual rocks, positioning them accurately, allowing the authentic mortar to cure properly and rigorously, verifying the level and alignment every single morning before attempting to add the subsequent layer. By the time the warmth of June rolled into the valley, the transformation was undeniable. The house once again possessed solid soaring walls, sturdy roof framing, and pristine flooring that didn't offer a single creak or sag underfoot. That was the precise moment Leland Harding paid me an unexpected visit. Leland was 65 years old, operating the historic blacksmith forge, situated 3 miles down the mountain road. He had known me for decades, long enough to accurately interpret everything I deliberately left unsaid. He possessed the rare perception to recognize that a craftsman's physical frame was slowly deteriorating at the exact moment he initiated the most crucial project of his existence. He pulled his battered pickup truck up to the site one afternoon, quietly stepped through the threshold, and walked through the rising rooms without uttering a syllable. He slowly ran a rough, soot-stained palm across the newly set fireplace stones, executing the silent inspection. One true craftsman offers another when he respects the labor enough to truly examine it. After his initial walkthrough, he quietly stationed himself within the main doorway, silently observing my movements. I was in the middle of positioning the heavy capstones on the smaller bedroom fireplace. My hands were exceptionally uncooperative that afternoon, the knuckles swollen to twice their normal size, my fingers stubbornly resisting the fluid movements required for the task. Severe arthritis had been stealthily creeping into my joints for over 2 years, but during that particular June, it had abandoned its subtle advance. It was actively staging a coup. Leland fixed his gaze on my trembling, misshapen hands and maintained his silence. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and I knew he understood. We remained locked in that quiet space, him anchoring the doorway, me desperately gripping a trowel with fingers that lacked adequate strength. Neither of us dared to voice the agonizing truth that echoed louder than any tool in the room. This specific structure represented the absolute final masterpiece my failing body would ever allow me to complete. Once this project reached its conclusion, my hands would no longer possess the capability to wield heavy tools. They would lose their ability to interpret stone. They would cease to build. "Are you tackling this entire project completely? Solo?" Leland eventually asked, breaking the silence. "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He offered a slow, knowing nod. He stood there for another long moment, absorbing the atmosphere. Finally, he murmured, "Reach out if you find yourself needing an extra pair of hands," before turning to walk back to his truck. Despite the pain and the terrifying realization of my physical decline, I refused to halt my progress. Though in truth I wasn't entirely isolated out there in the woods. At least not after the chilly month of March, when a remarkably perceptive 9-year-old girl picked up a discarded foundation stone and posed the one profound question that would ultimately redefine the entire trajectory of this legacy. But that remarkable encounter belongs to a later chapter of this journey. On that warm June afternoon, standing inside the skeletal frame of the house, while Leland watched my hands shake, I remained completely blind to the true cost of this endeavor. I had no concept of the brutal lessons it would impart, the staggering toll it would exact from my spirit, or the unexpected salvation it would ultimately deliver. I only possessed one absolute certainty: I had to bring this structure to absolute completion. And I was acutely aware that my hands were rapidly running out of time. That girl was Chloe. March 2023 month. 3 of the restoration, my daughter-in-law Stephanie brought her to the site. Stephanie Vance was 33, a marketing consultant from Boston, who wore her tailored precision like armor and viewed the world through the lens of whether things fit her aesthetic. She'd called the day before, said Chloe had been asking about what Grandpa was building. Could they stop by on their way back from Lenox? I said yes. They arrived in Stephanie's spotless white SUV. Chloe climbed out first, 9 years old, with her grandmother Clara's dark, perceptive eyes, the kind of eyes that looked at things instead of past them. She had Clara's way of tilting her head when she was thinking too, that particular angle of careful attention. Stephanie surveyed the construction site with the expression of someone reading a menu in a foreign language, polite but uncomprehending. She stayed near the car, checking her phone, while Chloe walked straight to the east wall foundation where I was excavating. The child knelt in the dirt without hesitation, picked up a stone from the excavation pile, one of the original foundation stones I'd carefully removed and set aside for reuse. "Grandpa, how old is this stone?" she asked. 130 years, I said. "It's been part of this wall since before your great-grandfather was born." She turned it over in her small hands, ran her fingers along the surface where a mason's chisel had marked it in 1893. She held it the way you'd hold something precious, not gripping tight, but cradling it, aware of its weight and what that weight meant. Children collect things the way rivers collect stones, not randomly, but with an instinct for what matters, what will last. "Can I keep it?" Chloe asked. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. "That stone has been waiting a long time for someone who'd appreciate it." She slipped it into her coat pocket, not carelessly, deliberately, the way you put something away that you know you'll need later, even if you don't yet know why. Stephanie called from the car. "We should get going, Chloe. You have piano at 4. They stayed 40 minutes total. Stephanie asked 3 polite questions about the timeline and whether I had help. Chloe asked 17 questions about stone and mortar and why the windows were smaller than modern ones, and whether Clara had ever seen this house when it still stood whole. As they drove away, I watched Chloe turn in the rear seat to look back at the house. Her small hand gripped the stone through her coat pocket. Stephanie never once asked why I was building it. But Chloe understood something her mother didn't. Some people see a pile of old stones and think rubble. Others see the same pile and think foundation. I went back to work. 4 months passed. The house rose from ruin with the patience of something that had waited 130 years and could wait a little longer. Walls climbed. The roof took shape. Floors settled into place with the solid thunk of wood that knows its purpose. Then in July, I found what Clara had left for me. The north wall section needed complete rebuilding. Too much water-damaged stones shifted beyond repair. I was taking it down, carefully salvaging what I could when I found the hollow. Small, deliberate, hidden deep in the old masonry where you'd only find it if you were dismantling the wall stone by stone. Inside a notebook wrapped in waxed cloth against the moisture. I knew the handwriting on the cover before I unwrapped it. Clara's. My hands, swollen and aching from the morning's work, shook as I peeled back the waxed cloth. The notebook was dry, perfectly preserved. She'd sealed it, carefully protected it, the way you protect something you know will need to survive. I opened the first page, saw her handwriting, the precise loops and careful slants she'd kept since grade school. Saw the date at the top, March 2023, weeks before her diagnosis. Read the first line. Arthur, if you're reading this, you've finally done what we always talked about. I closed it. I stood there in the rubble of the north wall, holding my wife's words, and I thought she knew. Clara knew I would do this. I knew I'd find it here. She'd hidden it before the cancer, before the diagnosis, before everything changed. Hidden it in a wall she knew would eventually fall and knew I would eventually rebuild. My wife had left me a message on a stone wall, but I wasn't ready to read it. Not yet, I said out loud to the empty construction site. I'm not ready to read this yet. I sat down on the rubble pile. The afternoon sun slanted through the incomplete roof framing. Somewhere down the valley I could hear Leland's hammer ringing against his anvil, steady, rhythmic, the sound of a man doing work he's done for 40 years. I held the notebook on my knee, didn't open it again, just sat there as the light changed and the shadows lengthened, and the mountain air cooled. But I will be, I said finally. When the time comes, I'll know. I wrapped the notebook back in its waxed cloth, drove home as darkness fell, walked into my kitchen and set it on the table beside Clara's other notebook, the one she'd left unfinished the night before, her diagnosis pen still resting in the fold. 2 notebooks now, 2 messages. One she'd meant to finish and couldn't, one she'd finished and hidden where only I would find it. I didn't read either of them. Not that night, not next week, not for another 14 months. But I knew the way you know things in your bones before your brain catches up that I would read it eventually. I knew exactly what moment would make me ready. That moment was still 15 months away, and it would arrive wearing my son's face. My son Julian was 32 years old when I finished the house. A financial analyst at a Boston investment firm, he'd spent the past decade building a life defined by numbers and returns, and the careful distance he maintained from anything that reminded him of his father's calloused hand world. April 2024. 3 weeks before final completion, I sent him a text message. The house is finished. Come see it when you're free. Bring the family. 22 months of work can be finished in an afternoon. 22 months of hope can be dismissed in a single text message sent the following day. Julian replied the next morning, not that evening, the next morning at 9:14. I was grouting bathroom tiles when my phone buzzed on the workbench. Busy, maybe Memorial Day weekend. 4 words. Memorial Day was 6 weeks away. I read the message twice, set my phone on the kitchen table beside Clara's notebooks, returned to grouting without texting back. 6 weeks. I spent 22 months there. My son could wait 6 weeks. A text message is just light on a screen until it isn't, until it becomes the thing that tells you exactly where you stand in someone's life. What I didn't know then, Julian's major investment contract with a Boston firm had collapsed 3 days before I sent that text. 3 days of him searching desperately for collateral, for leverage, for anything that could salvage what he'd lost. But I didn't know that yet. I just knew my son had reduced 22 months of my life to maybe. I finished grouting the tiles, installed the kitchen countertop I'd planted from salvaged cherry, hung the last interior door. The house was complete in every detail that mattered, every stone set right, every board chosen for grain and purpose, every joint fitted tight enough to last another century. And my son was busy. 2 weeks before Memorial Day, Leland came to my workshop. He didn't knock, never did, just walked in while I was planning the final section of the countertop, stood there watching me work the way he always did, when he had something to say but wasn't sure how to say it. There's been a truck, he said finally. I kept planning, long smooth strokes feeling the cherry grain respond under the blade. Gray pickup, 3 days straight. Someone is taking pictures of your house. I stopped, set the plane down carefully. I got the plate number, Leland continued. Massachusetts rental plates. Professional job, not a curious neighbor. 3 days. Someone had been watching my house for 3 days, and I'd been too focused on the countertop grain to notice. Do you want me to call the police? Leland asked. No, I said. I already know whose car it is. Leland studied me across the workshop. 65 years of reading people the way I read stone, and he could see I wasn't guessing. Your boy. Not him directly, I said, but yes. Julian had hired someone to photograph my house, to assess its value, to turn 22 months of my hands into a number on a spreadsheet. He'd done this before agreeing to visit, before bringing his family to see what I'd built, before even pretending to care about anything except what it was worth. I picked up the plane again, Resumed working the cherry, watching the thin curls of wood peel away under the blade. The rhythm was important, the steadiness. If you let anger into your hands when you're working wood, the wood knows. It shows in the cut. "What are you going to do?" Leland asked. "Nothing," I said. "Let him come Memorial Day. Let him see it. And then I'll know what I need to know." Leland nodded, stood there another minute, then left without saying anything else. He understood. Some things you have to let happen before you can decide how to respond. I worked until dark, finished the countertop, carried it to the house, and set it in place, a perfect fit, the way things fit when you measure twice and cut once and don't rush the work. The house was ready. My son had hired a private investigator to photograph it, and I still had Clara's notebooks sitting on my kitchen table unread. That evening I did something I hadn't done in 22 months. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts to a name I hadn't called since Clara's funeral. Marcus Sterling. He answered on the second ring. "Arthur." His voice carried surprise, but not displeasure. "Been a while." "Marcus," I said, "I need to ask you about something. About property valuation." There was a pause. Then, "What kind of property?" "A house I just finished restoring. 1890s fieldstone, 1,800 square feet. Original materials where possible, period-appropriate methods throughout." "Sounds like your kind of work," Marcus said. "Why do you need a valuation?" "Because my son is going to ask for one," I said, "and I want to know the number before he does." Another pause, longer this time. "I see," Marcus said quietly. "When can I look at it?" "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I'll be there." I hung up, set the phone down. I looked at Clara's notebooks on the table, the unfinished one from the night before her diagnosis, the hidden one from the stone wall that I still hadn't opened. Memorial Day weekend was still 2 weeks away, but I was no longer waiting for my son to visit. I was preparing for what would come after. Marcus came the next morning. I walked through the house for 40 minutes, took photographs, made notes in a leather journal, then gave me a number that made sense of why Julian had hired someone to photograph the place. I was ready, or I thought I was. Memorial Day. Saturday arrived warm and clear. I stood on the porch I'd built from reclaimed hemlock and watched the black Tesla climb the gravel drive. The car looked wrong there, too polished, too expensive, making the kind of noise that said the driver had never driven on anything but pavement. Stephanie stepped out first, tailored blazer designer sunglasses, surveying the property the way someone surveys a vacation rental to see if it matches the online photos. Then Chloe burst from the back seat. "Grandpa, the stone house is finished." She ran straight to me, and I caught her in a hug that reminded me why I'd spent 22 months doing this. Behind her, Arthur Vance, 7 years old, with the unselfconscious curiosity of young children who collect interesting rocks without needing to explain why, immediately bent down and picked up a pebble from the gravel. He studied it for a moment, then slipped it into his jacket pocket, like a small talisman against a world that doesn't yet make complete sense. Julian emerged from the driver's side last, stood beside the Tesla for a moment, adjusting his shirt cuffs, then looked up at the fieldstone facade I'd rebuilt by hand. His first words, "It looks old." "It is old," I said. "That's the point. There's a particular way a person walks through a house when they're measuring square footage instead of appreciating joinery. Fast or clinical, like counting inventory in a warehouse." Julian walked that way. He moved past the original pine door 2 inches thick, hung on hand-forged hinges, a door I'd disassembled and reassembled 3 times, to get the latch perfect without pausing to look. Stepped through the threshold I'd set level to within a 16th of an inch, glanced at the chestnut flooring I'd sourced from a Lenox demolition, yard boards that had been ceiling joists in a hotel built the same year as this house. "How long did you say this took?" he asked. 22 months, I said, every day. He nodded the way you nod at information that doesn't particularly interest you. Stephanie moved through the rooms, touching things with the tips of her fingers, opened one of the maple drawers I'd milled from a storm-fallen tree on my own property, closed it carefully, and said, "Charming." The word had an inflection that meant the opposite. Chloe, meanwhile, was running her hands along the fieldstone walls, asking questions about mortar composition and why some stones were darker than others. Tyler had found another pebble and was comparing it to the first one in his pocket, holding them up to the light coming through the west window. Julian stood before the large fieldstone fireplace, the one that had taken me 6 weeks to restore. 6 weeks of choosing each stone, setting it, letting the mortar cure, checking level and plumb every morning before adding the next course. He looked at it for maybe 10 seconds. "Why didn't you just sell the land and buy something move-in ready?" he asked. "Something near Boston." "The commute from here would be brutal." I stood very still. "I built this for you," I said quietly. 4 words I'd been waiting 22 months to say. Julian heard them and looked at his wife instead of at me. Stephanie was examining the kitchen opening cabinet doors, checking the underlayment of the sink. Professional. Detached. The way a realtor walks through a staging before listing. "It's very—" She paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound harsh. "Rustic." Julian lowered his voice, stepped closer to me. "Honestly, Dad," he glanced toward Stephanie, then back to me. "It looks like a stone tomb. Not our style. Not our style. 22 months. Every wall, every floor, every window frame and door jamb and piece of trim. The 6-week fireplace, the hand-forged hinges, the reclaimed chestnut, the storm-fallen maple, the gravel drive I'd graded myself. I didn't say anything. Couldn't say anything. Just stood there in the house I'd built with hands that were giving out, listening to my son explain why 2 decades of my knowledge and 22 months of my labor didn't match his aesthetic. Through the west window I could see Chloe, in what used to be Clara's vegetable garden. She'd found 2 foundation stones I'd set aside during excavation, was attempting to stack one on top of the other, testing balance with her small hands. Adjusting, trying again. The exact motion I'd made when I was 7 years old, learning from my grandfather how to read stone. Inside, Julian was saying something to Stephanie about the commute to Charlotte, about how far this was from anything. I walked to the window, put my hands on the sill I'd planed from a single piece of oak, no joints, smooth as glass. I watched Chloe finally get the balance right, watch her step back and look at her 2-stone tower with the satisfaction of someone who's just learned something important. My hands were still on that windowsill when Julian found me there. He stood beside me for a moment. We both watched Chloe through the glass. "Dad," he said. His voice had changed. Not apologetic, not warm, something else. Something that sounded rehearsed. "We need to talk about what happens next." "Let's step outside," Julian said. There's a tone of voice that separates a son asking his father for help from a businessman demanding collateral. Julian found that tone on the porch of a house his father had spent 22 months building for him. We stood on the hemlock boards I'd planned by hand. Through the window behind us, I could hear Chloe asking Stephanie something about the stones in the garden. Julian positioned himself so his back was to the window, so his family couldn't see his face. His voice changed. Not apologetic anymore, not dismissive, cold, direct. "I have a serious financial problem," he said. "I need to mortgage this property with a bank before November 15th. The land is valuable enough to solve that problem. I need you to sign the ownership transfer papers." I stared at him, 10 seconds of silence. Long enough for him to shift his weight. Long enough for me to hear a cardinal calling from the oak tree Clara had planted in 1989. "What did you say?" I asked. Julian's jaw tightened. The look of someone who doesn't want to repeat himself but knows he has to. "Dad, I need to be blunt. The firm I'm with has exposure on a failed deal. This property, the land alone, is worth enough to secure the bridge loan I need. I need your signature by November." No please this time. November 15th, 6 months away. My son had given me a deadline to surrender the house I'd built for him. "You want me to sign over the property," I said. Not a question. A statement to make sure I'd heard correctly. "Transfer the deed to my name so I can use it as collateral." "Yes." Julian glanced toward the window where Stephanie was visible inside, examining the maple cabinets. "The appraisal I had done puts the land value alone at—" "You had it appraised?" "Of course I did." He said it like I was being unreasonable. I needed to know if it was worth enough to solve the problem. The gray pickup, the 3 days of surveillance, the rental plates. My son hadn't hired someone to photograph my house because he was proud of it. He'd hired someone to calculate what it could be sold for. "I built this for you," I said quietly. "I know." Julian's voice softened slightly, almost apologetic. "And I appreciate that, Dad. I really do. But I need this. My firm needs this. If I don't secure this bridge loan by November, I lose everything. Stephanie doesn't even know how bad it is yet." Inside, Chloe was pressing her face against the glass, watching us. She waved. I waved back. "I need an answer," Julian said. "How long does it take to understand that someone you raised doesn't see you the way you see them 22 months? or 22 seconds on a porch. Depends on whether you're willing to hear what they're actually saying. I need time to think, I said. Julian nodded. November 15th. That's the deadline. I'll have the papers drawn up. We can make this simple. He called for his family. Stephanie emerged from the house, Chloe reluctant to leave Tyler still clutching his pebbles. The black Tesla backed down the gravel driveway I'd laid, by hand, turned at the bend, disappeared behind the tree line. I stood on the porch until I couldn't hear the engine anymore. Then I went inside. The house was exactly as I'd left it that morning. 12,000 stones, 22 months, every wall and floor and fireplace built to last another century. The large fieldstone hearth that had taken me 6 weeks. The chestnut flooring from Lenox, the maple cabinets from the storm-fallen tree. Every detail chosen, every joint fitted, every surface smoothed. My son wanted to use it as collateral for a bank loan. I made a sandwich at the kitchen table Clara and I had used for 28 years, sat there eating it as the afternoon light changed, and the shadows lengthened, and the sun dropped behind the Taconic Range. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. I sat in silence and thought about what Julian had said. About November 15th. About the way he'd looked at the fieldstone walls, not as something his father had built, but as something a bank could appraise. About the fact that he'd had the property surveyed before he'd even agreed to visit. The sandwich tasted like nothing. Darkness fell. I sat at that table until I couldn't see the house across the property anymore. Just my reflection in the window glass. An old man in an empty kitchen. I want to sell you the house, I told Marcus Sterling. But that call came Monday morning. Before that came the sandwich. Some decisions are made in silence with nothing but a sandwich and a sunset, not impulsively, but with the kind of clarity that comes when someone finally shows you exactly who they are. Memorial Day evening. I sat at the kitchen table Clara and I had used for 28 years and ate a sandwich I'd made myself. White bread, deli turkey, nothing special. The television stayed off. The sun set behind the Taconic Range. Light through the west window turned gold, then amber, then gray. I sat there and watched the color drain from the sky. 28 years, this table. My hand rested on the wood grain, feeling the small dent where Clara had dropped a ceramic bowl in 2003. The scratch from when we'd moved it into this house in 1996. The worn spot where her coffee cup had sat every morning for nearly 3 decades. Clara's notebook lay beside my plate, still wrapped in its waxed cloth. I touched it, but didn't open it. Not yet. I thought about Julian's words on the porch, about the November 15th deadline he'd given me like a banker scheduling a payment, about the way he'd said the land alone, as if the 12,000 stones I'd touched with my own hands didn't matter, as if 22 months of my life were just landscaping on top of what he really wanted. Silence has texture when you sit in it long enough. This silence felt like fieldstone old cold, holding weight without complaint. 12,000 stones. I'd touched everyone. November 15th, my son had given me a deadline. At 9 o'clock I washed my plate, dried it, put it away, went to bed. Monday morning arrived clear. I made coffee. Stood on my back porch looking across the 8-acre property at Clara's house. The early light caught the fieldstone walls the way it had caught them for 130 years, making them glow, making them look like something worth saving. Completed. Perfect. Authentic 1890s stonework that nobody else alive could replicate. I went inside, picked up the phone, called Marcus Sterling. You know who Marcus Sterling is, the kind of developer who kneels down to examine floor joinery, who understands that some things can't be replicated once they're gone. 52 years old, ran a boutique development company specializing in historic New England properties. I'd met him 4 years earlier at a historic preservation workshop in Stockbridge. We'd spent 2 hours talking about lime mortar versus Portland cement, about why modern masons don't understand that stone needs to breathe. He'd given me his card, told me to call if I ever worked on something worth seeing. He answered on the second ring. Arthur, he said, good to hear from you. Marcus, I have something you should see. What kind of something? 1890-era fieldstone house, 1,800 square feet, complete restoration, original methods throughout. A pause. Then you finished it. I finished it. When can I see it? When you're free. This Thursday, Marcus said without hesitation. I'll drive up from New Haven, 2 hours. I can be there by noon. Thursday at noon, I said. Arthur, he paused. Are you selling it? Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. I'll bring my checkbook. Marcus said. I hung up, stood there in my kitchen holding the phone. Thursday, 3 days. I thought about calling Julian, telling him what I'd just done, giving him a chance to apologize, explain. Beg me not to sell the house he'd called a stone tomb. Number. I set the phone down. I wasn't calling Julian. I had no obligation to call Julian. The deed was clear. From the day of purchase back in '87 until the moment Clara passed, it remained under my legal control. Julian held nothing but expectations while I held the title and the tax bills. The deed said my name, the tax bills came to my address. The sweat that rebuilt the house came from my body. Julian had grown up visiting this property on weekends, had helped Clara plant tomatoes in the garden when he was 8, had brought Stephanie here exactly twice in the past decade, both times staying less than an hour. He'd never asked about the house while I was building it, never visited during the 22 months of restoration, never called to see how the work was going, or if I needed help, or if my hands were holding up. Then he'd shown up Memorial Day weekend with an appraiser's number in his pocket and a deadline in his mouth. November 15th. 6 months to sign over my land so his failing investment firm could use it as collateral. I finished my coffee, set the empty cup in the sink, walked back out to the porch and looked one more time at Clara's house across the property. The house Julian had called a stone tomb. The house Julian wanted to mortgage to save his career. The house that had never been Julian's to claim because the deed, the taxes, the sweat, the 22 months, all of it had been mine alone. Thursday Marcus Sterling would drive up from New Haven, and I would show him exactly what authentic 1890s New England stonework looked like in the hands of someone who still knew how to build it. Thursday arrived clear and warm. Marcus Sterling's car pulled up the gravel drive at noon exactly. He stepped out gray hair work boots, despite the tailored shirt carrying a leather notebook that looked as old as some of the houses he'd restored. True expertise doesn't announce itself with compliments. It kneels down to examine joinery runs, fingertips along mortar lines, and stands silent before a fireplace for 15 minutes before saying a single word. That's what Marcus did. I unlocked the door and stepped aside. He entered slowly the way you enter a cathedral, aware that something important happened here, that the space deserves respect. He started with the chestnut flooring, knelt down right there in the doorway, ran his hand along the seam where 2 wide planks met, felt the joint with his fingertips testing how the edges aligned, pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and examined the underside of the threshold. Hand planed, he said, not a question. Yes? He stood, moved to the fieldstone walls. There's a difference between looking at a house and reading it. Marcus read those walls the way a scholar reads manuscripts, searching for what can't be faked. He touched each stone, not quickly, deliberately, the way a musician might touch an instrument before playing it, feeling texture, temperature, the fit of stone against stone. He examined the mortar joints, pressed his thumbnail gently into one, testing hardness and composition. Lime mortar, he said. Yes, I mixed it myself, traditional ratio. Not many people know how anymore. Not many people care. He smiled at that. Keep moving. Kitchen. He opened the maple cabinet doors I'd milled from the storm-fallen tree, examined the joinery, closed them, opened them again, listening to how they moved, how the wood had settled, whether the humidity had warped them. Bedrooms. He knelt at each baseboard, checking how the trim met the floor, opened windows to test the counterweights, ran his hand along the sills I'd planed from single pieces of oak. Then he reached the large fireplace, the one that had taken me 6 weeks. Marcus stood in front of it without speaking. 1 minute passed. 5 minutes. 10. 15 minutes. Marcus stood before that fireplace for 15 minutes without speaking. That silence said more than any appraisal report ever could. Finally, he turned to me. Your stonework technique, he said. I've examined over 200 historic New England constructions in the past 20 years. Preservation projects, museum pieces, properties on the National Register. He paused. This is the only one I've seen using the pure 1890s dry stone and lime mortar method. Not a hybrid, not a modern interpretation, the actual technique. Nobody can do this anymore, he continued quietly, because nobody knows how. The knowledge died with the last generation of masons who learned it as apprentices. He looked at me. Except you. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? What are your plans for the house? Marcus asked. I looked out the west-facing window, at the mountains Clara had loved, at the 8 acres we'd bought in 1987 with money we'd saved for 11 years. My son doesn't want it, I said quietly. Marcus nodded. Not surprised, not judgmental. Just acknowledging the reality that sometimes children don't value what their parents build. Would you sell it to me? He asked. I turned from the window. What would you do with it? Convert it to a luxury historic rental, Marcus said. High-end clients who appreciate authentic craftsmanship. People who want to experience what New England houses actually felt like in 1890, not what modern builders think they felt like. He walked to the fieldstone wall, put his hand on it. I'd keep the name, Clara's house. That's what you call it, isn't it? Yes, I'd keep everything exactly as it is. Every stone, every board, every detail. Nothing modernized unless it's invisible wiring, plumbing the things that have to meet code, but don't affect the historical integrity. He looked at me. Does that matter to you? I thought about Julian, about the way he'd walked through this house measuring square footage instead of appreciating craftsmanship, about the November 15th deadline, about his voice on the porch saying, "The land alone," as if 12,000 stones didn't exist. Yes, I said, it matters. Marcus pulled out his leather notebook, wrote something, tore out the page and handed it to me. One number, $1,100,000. I stared at it. The land is worth maybe 400,000, Marcus said. The house built by someone who still knows techniques that died in 1920 is worth the rest. More, actually, but I'm trying to make an offer you'll consider seriously, rather than an offer that sounds like flattery. He put the notebook back in his pocket. This isn't about flipping property. This is about preservation, about keeping something alive that can't be rebuilt once it's gone, about honoring work that deserves to be honored. I looked down at the number again. $1,100,000. $230,000 more than I'd privately estimated the property might be worth. $230,000 more than Julian's appraiser had probably told him it was worth. I'll call you tomorrow morning, I said. Marcus nodded, shook my hand, walked to his car, and drove back down the gravel drive toward New Haven. I stood at the west window looking out at mountains Clara had loved, the afternoon light, turning everything gold. Marcus Sterling's offer came with something more valuable than money. It came with recognition that what I'd built couldn't be replaced, that 22 months of my life had created something irreplaceable. Tomorrow morning I would make a call, but tonight I had a different call to make first. That different thing wasn't a call, it was a drive. Thursday night I drove to the overlook on the Taconic Range where Clara and I used to go when big decisions needed thinking, a dirt pull-out just wide enough for 2 cars facing west across the valley. Some decisions aren't made by weighing options, but by reading threats. And when someone threatens your access to your grandchildren, the clarity arrives not as choice, but as certainty. I parked, turned off the engine, sat as the valley lights appeared below and stars emerged above. Clara and I had sat here in 1987 deciding whether to buy the 8 acres. Sat here in 1992 deciding whether to expand my masonry business or keep it small and personal. Sat here in 2020, the week after her diagnosis, not deciding anything, just sitting together while we still could. I pulled out my phone to check messages. One email, sent 3 hours earlier while Marcus had been examining the house. From an attorney, representing Julian. I opened it. Formal language. Legal letterhead. The kind of words designed to sound reasonable while delivering threats. Pending resolution of property dispute and cooperation with reasonable request before November. Deadline legal action may be pursued to restrict visitation rights with minor grandchildren in the best interests of family stability. I read it again, then a third time. My son had hired a lawyer to threaten my access to Chloe and Tyler, not because I'd done anything to harm them, not because I was unfit or dangerous, but because I wouldn't sign over my land so he could mortgage it for his failing investment firm. Threaten a man's work and he'll negotiate. Threaten his access to his grandchildren and watch what happens next. I closed the phone, looked out at the valley for 30 minutes, complete silence, no radio, no engine, just the sound of wind through pine trees and my own breathing. Clara, I said to the empty truck cab, I think you'd do the same. I wasn't considering anymore. I was confirming what I already knew I'd do. The overlook had given me my answer, same as it always had, same as it had given Clara and me for 28 years of marriage. I drove home, went to bed, slept better than I had in weeks. Friday morning, 7 o'clock, I called Marcus Sterling from my kitchen. He answered on the second ring. Arthur, I was hoping to hear from you. Marcus, I said, we have a deal. Silence for a moment. Then I'm glad. Are there any conditions? One, I said, the name of the house. What do you want to name it? Clara's house. 2 seconds of silence on the line. Clara's house. 2 words. Marcus understood immediately why that mattered more than any dollar amount ever could. Of course, he said quietly. Clara's house it is. I'll have it written into the deed that the property maintains that name in perpetuity. Thank you. The closing will be in September, Marcus continued. I'll have my attorney draw up the paperwork. Standard Massachusetts property transfer. Clean title. You'll need to bring proof of ownership, tax records, the usual documentation. I have everything. I know you do, Marcus said, and something in his voice told me he understood more than just the legal requirements. He understood what this house meant, what this sale meant. One more thing, I said. I'd like Leland Harding present at the closing as witness. The blacksmith? Yes, of course. I'll make sure the closing accommodates his schedule. We talked about details for another 10 minutes. Wire transfer versus certified check, title insurance, inspection waiver. Marcus laughed at that, said he'd spent 2 hours inspecting and found the house in better condition than properties half its age. Then we hung up. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, stood at the kitchen window looking out at the 8 acres, at Clara's house sitting completed across the property, at the morning light turning the fieldstone walls gold. September closing, 4 months before Julian's November 15th deadline. I didn't call Julian, didn't text him, had no legal obligation to inform him. The land had been in my name since 1987. Clara's name too until she died. Then mine alone. Always was mine. Never transferred, never promised, never given away. Always would be mine until the title transferred to Marcus Sterling. Julian had made an assumption, had assumed that because he was my son, because he'd grown up visiting this property, because he'd helped Clara plant tomatoes here when he was 8 years old, had assumed that gave him some kind of claim. But assumption isn't ownership, and threats aren't negotiation. I opened my phone, found the attorney's email about restricting my visitation rights, read it one more time, didn't delete it, save it to a folder, evidence I'd keep, not because I needed it for a lawyer, but because I wanted to remember exactly what moment had made this decision irrevocable. The moment my son threatened my access to Chloe and Tyler. The moment he proved he didn't understand what family actually means. I finished my coffee, washed the cup, set it in the dish rack to dry. Marcus would handle the paperwork, the attorneys, the title transfer, the wire transfer of funds. But I had one more thing to do before September. Decide where every dollar of that money would go, and Julian's name wouldn't appear anywhere on that list. September arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after months of waiting. Money is just numbers on paper until you decide who deserves it and who doesn't. Then it becomes the most honest sentence you'll ever write about what you value and who you trust. Closing day. My cousin Everett Vance's law office in the Berkshires. Small practice, wood-paneled walls, the smell of old law books and fresh coffee. Marcus Sterling sat across the conference table with his attorney. Everett sat beside me with a folder full of documents that would transfer Clara's house from my name to Marcus's. Gross sale $1,100,000. After fees, taxes, closing costs. The machinery of property transfer that takes its percentage before you ever see a check net proceeds came to $842,000. Everett slid a blank legal pad across the table. Arthur, he said quietly, how do you want to allocate this? I picked up the pen. I wrote 3 lines myself. First line, irrevocable trust for Chloe Ann Vance. Unconditional. Open age 18. $700,000. Second line, Berkshire County Historical Preservation Trust. Restoration of 1880s village school in Cheshire. $80,000. Third line, remaining $62,000 for living expenses and selective work. $700,000. Every penny protected from the son who'd called it a stone tomb. Every penny waiting for the granddaughter who'd kept a foundation stone in her pocket. Everett looked at the list, then at me. Julian, he asked. One word, not accusatory, not surprised, just confirming what the paper already showed. No, I said. Single word, final. Everett nodded, made notes on a separate legal pad, started drafting the trust language that would make it irrevocable, unconditional, inaccessible to anyone except Chloe herself when she turned 18. Julian couldn't touch it. I couldn't control it. Couldn't claim any portion of it regardless of what happened next. Regardless of what lawyers he hired or what threats he made. The trust would sit there growing, waiting for a 9-year-old girl to become an 18-year-old woman who understood the value of foundation stones. Leland Harding arrived 20 minutes later, walked into the conference room in his work clothes, hands still showing traces of forged soot he'd tried to wash off. "I'll sign as a trustee," he said. Didn't ask why Julian's name appeared nowhere on the page. I didn't need to. He'd watched me work alone for 22 months. I'd seen my hands giving out, had said nothing that June afternoon when he understood. This house would be my last. He signed wherever it indicated, dated it, put down the pen. "She'll use it well," Leland said. Not a question, a statement. "I know she will," I said. Marcus's attorney pushed the final documents across the table. I signed. Marcus signed. Everett notarized. The house that had been mine for 22 months of restoration, the land that had been mine since 1987, transferred to Marcus Sterling, with one condition written into the deed. The property would maintain the name Clara's house in perpetuity. We shook hands. Marcus promised to send photographs once he'd completed the conversion to a luxury rental. Said he'd make sure every guest understood the history, the 1890s techniques, the lime mortar and dry stone, the hand-planed chestnut floors. I drove home. That evening I cooked pot roast, Clara's recipe, handwritten card from the kitchen drawer, her exact measurements in her exact handwriting. The paper is soft from years of use, soft from years of her hands touching it, folding it, returning it to the drawer after Sunday dinners. That softness felt like the only thing I had left that she'd actually held. I followed her instructions exactly. 3 pounds chuck roast, 2 cups of beef stock, 4 carrots, 6 small potatoes, 1 yellow onion, thyme from the garden she'd planted, salt and pepper to taste. The house was filled with the smell of cooking, the same smell that had filled our kitchen every third Sunday for 28 years. I ate alone at the table we'd used since 1996. Television off, just the sound of silverware against the plate and the silence that had become familiar. After I washed the dishes, I did something I hadn't done in 15 months. I took Clara's notebook from its place on the kitchen table, beside her unfinished crossword puzzle, both of them sitting there exactly where I'd left them since finding the notebook in that stone hollow back in July of last year. 15 months. I'd been carrying the weight of that unopened notebook for 15 months. I sat down. I opened it. Read only the first page. Clara's handwriting, the precise loops and careful slant I'd known for 3 decades, the same hand that had written the pot roast recipe, the same hand that had written our grocery lists and birthday cards, and the note she'd left on my workshop bench in 2003 that said, "Come inside, the coffee's getting cold." The first page contained 1 sentence. "If you read this, it means you've already done it. Now don't stop." I closed the notebook, placed my hand on the worn leather cover, sat without moving for a long time. Clara had known. I had anticipated I would restore that house. I had anticipated I would face exactly this situation. I knew I would need her words at exactly this moment, and she'd told me not to stop. I didn't read the rest. Not yet. I'd read it when I needed to, when the next moment arrived. But I understood what the first page meant. She'd watched me work for 38 years. Watched me choose stone over concrete, hand tools over power tools, slow precision over fast efficiency. Watched me value craft over profit. She'd known I would sell the house rather than let Julian mortgage it, and she'd known I'd need permission to keep going after I did. I placed the notebook back on the table beside her crossword puzzle. 1 month from now, Julian would discover the sale, and everything Clara had written in those pages would matter more than I could imagine. That month passed. The phone rang at 7:40 on a Tuesday morning in October, and I knew before answering that Julian had finally seen the magazine. Knew it from the time Julian never called this early. Knew it from the particular silence between the second and third ring. The silence of someone steeling themselves to say something they've been rehearsing. I answered. "Tell me what I just read isn't true," Julian said, voice strained, controlled fury underneath every word. "Depends what you read," I said. "You sold the house." "Yes." $1.1 million. "Yes." There's an 8-page spread in Berkshire magazine. They're calling it Clara's house. A feature article calling it a masterclass in historic preservation. 8 pages. They'd written 8 pages about the house Julian had spent 45 seconds dismissing. "Yes," I said. "We should have had that money." His voice broke in that sentence. Not grief, rage. "You could have had the house," I said quietly. You called it a stone tomb. That's not I didn't mean. He stopped, started again. You had no right. I have every right, I said. My land, my house, my name on every document since 1987. Silence on the line. Then this isn't the end, Dad. He hung up. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, still warm. 3 weeks later, early November, an envelope arrived. Pearson Associates. Boston address. Law firm letterhead designed to look expensive and intimidating. I opened it. 3 pages. Formal language, aggressive positioning. Evelyn Pierce, attorney at law, representing Julian Vance in a claim regarding property. Located at, she listed my address, my 8 acres, as if I didn't know where I lived. The meat of it came on page 2. Legal letters are designed to sound inevitable, like gravity or taxes. Formal language meant to make you forget that paper has no power until a judge signs it. But I read it carefully. The claim the 8-acre property was undivided common, marital property, including inheritance contribution from deceased Clara Vance. Therefore, Arthur Vance had no right to sell without Julian Vance's consent as legal heir, demanding immediate payment of 50% of the net proceeds, $421,000. Julian was attacking through Clara's memory, claiming she'd contributed to buying the land, claiming that contribution entitled him as her heir to half of what I'd received from Marcus Sterling, weaponizing her legacy to take money she'd never have wanted him to have. I walked to my workshop, faxed the 3 pages to Everett. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Arthur, Everett said, I just read it. And he has no legal standing. Clara's contribution was compensated through other assets decades ago, but he's going to try to freeze your accounts while this plays out in court. Make it expensive. Make it painful. Can he do that? He can try. A judge would have to approve it, and no judge will once they see the documentation, but it'll be uncomfortable for a while. I looked out the workshop window at the space where Clara's house had stood. Gone now, sold. Transferred to Marcus Sterling's name with one condition written into the deed. What do you need from me? I asked. Nothing yet, Everett said. I need 2 days to pull together the 1987 documentation. Bank statements showing you paid for the land entirely from your own account. Records showing Clara's contribution was compensated separately through a savings transfer in 1989. Once Evelyn Pierce sees that evidence, this lawsuit dies. 2 days. 2 days, Arthur. He paused. This won't stand. Julian's attorney is good at aggressive positioning, but she's about to learn that some cases require actual evidence, not just threatening letterhead. We hung up. I stood in my workshop looking at tools I could barely hold anymore. Hands that had touched 12,000 stones. Hands that had built the last house they'd ever build. Julian wanted half of what I'd received for that house. Wanted to claim it through his mother's memory. Wanted to take $400,000 and use it to salvage his failing investment firm. I walked back to my kitchen, sat at the 28-year-old table. Clara's notebook sat where I'd left it, beside her unfinished crossword puzzle. I'd read only the first page, the sentence that said, if you read this, it means you've already done it. Now don't stop. But there were more pages. Pages I hadn't opened yet. Pages Clara had written, knowing I would need them at exactly the right moment. Everett would gather his 1987 bank records, would prove I'd paid for the land outright, would show documentation that I'd compensated Clara separately for her contribution through transfers, and shared assets that had nothing to do with that 8-acre property. The evidence would be irrefutable. Evelyn Pierce would see it within 48 hours and know her case had no foundation. But I knew something Everett didn't know yet. The strongest evidence wasn't in a bank file from 1987. It was in Clara's notebook, still sitting on my kitchen table, still mostly unread, waiting for the moment I'd need it most. But first came the bank statements. Wednesday morning, November, Everett's law office. He'd spent 2 days gathering them, 37 years of paperwork pulled from file cabinets that smelled like old paper and patient documentation. Bank statements from 1987 don't lie the way people do. Every deposit, every transfer, every compensation sits in black ink on white paper, indifferent to what anyone claims 3 decades later. Everett spread them across his desk. 1987, he said, pointing to the first document. You paid $45,000 from your personal savings account. Sole purchaser. Clara's name doesn't appear on the purchase agreement. Her funds don't appear in the transaction. I looked at the papers, Recognized my signature from when I was 28 years old. Remembered sitting in a different attorney's office signing those documents, while Clara waited in the car 7 months pregnant with Julian. But this is the crucial one, Everett continued. He slid another document across the desk. 1989, 2 years later, savings account transfer to Clara Vance, $12,500. I remembered that too. Remembered the conversation Clara and I had at this same kitchen table that still sits in my house today, about how she'd worked part-time as a bookkeeper those first 2 years, while I was building my masonry business, about compensation, about fairness. The notation here, Everett pointed to handwriting in the margin. Compensation for household contribution startup years, 1987 through 1989. Documented, dated, notarized. 37 years. Those bank statements had been sitting in a file cabinet for 37 years, waiting to prove exactly this. Julian has no legal standing whatsoever, Everett said. His attorney will understand this within 48 hours once I send copies. The claim that Clara had an inheritance stake in the land is factually false. You purchased it solely with your funds. You compensated her fairly and completely in 1989 for her contribution to family expenses during your business startup. The documentation is irrefutable. I nodded. How long before this ends? I asked. Evelyn Pierce will withdraw the claim within a week. No attorney pursues a case this obviously disproven by documentary evidence. It would risk her reputation. And if she doesn't, then we go to court, and a judge dismisses it in the first hearing. Either way, Julian gets nothing. I left Everett's office at noon, drove to Leland's forge, found him at the anvil shaping a gate hinge. He looked up when I walked in, setting down his heavy hammer. I was waiting for you, he said. Need to tell you something. Julian came here 2 weeks ago, right before that lawyer's letter arrived at your house. He wiped his hands on his apron, looked at me directly, asked me to provide testimony, said you showed signs of memory decline during the 22 months you worked on that house. Confused thinking, said I should have noticed it, said it would help his case. I didn't move. He brought an envelope, Leland continued, set it on my workbench. Didn't say what was in it, didn't need to. The envelope in Leland's story, unopened, thrown back, mattered more than any dollar amount inside it. Leland had refused without needing to know the price. I threw it back across the bench, Leland said. Told him to leave my shop. Told him not to come back. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I asked. Wanted to see how far he'd actually go. Now we know. I placed one hand on Leland's shoulder. I stood there for a long moment. Couldn't find words that mattered more than silence. Then I walked out into the November cold, stood in the gravel lot beside my truck, understood with absolute clarity what I was facing. May the private investigator in the gray pickup watching my property for 3 days, photographing the house assessing value. June, the threatening email from Julian's attorney about restricting my visitation rights with Chloe and Tyler. Early November, Julian visiting Leland's forge with an envelope trying to buy false testimony about my mental decline. Mid-November, the lawsuit claiming Clara's inheritance stake demanding half the proceeds. This wasn't a son angry about a house sale. This wasn't an impulsive reaction or emotional outburst. This was a campaign. Planned, coordinated, escalating. Each move calculated, each pressure point identified, each avenue of attack explored systematically. The private investigator to establish property value. The visitation threat to establish leverage. The bribery attempt to establish credibility issues. The inheritance lawsuit to establish legal grounds. Julian wasn't just suing me. He was building a case designed to prove I was mentally unfit, that I had sold the property in a state of confusion, that the sale should be voided and the proceeds distributed to him as rightful heir. And he'd started this campaign back in May. 6 months of planning? 6 months before I'd even called Marcus Sterling. I got in my truck, drove home, sat at my kitchen table looking at Clara's notebook. The bank statements from 1987 would destroy Julian's inheritance claim, but they wouldn't end the campaign, because campaigns don't stop until someone wins or someone breaks, and I had no intention of breaking. Thanksgiving arrived anyway. Some things don't stop for lawsuits or campaigns or the fact that a father and son haven't spoken in months. Family gatherings have their own momentum, their own expectations, and breaking them requires more explanation than keeping them. So we gathered. 14 people can sit around a Thanksgiving table and pass cranberry sauce and pretend everything is normal. But tension has a frequency, something below hearing, above ignoring. and everyone in that room could feel it. Russell Thornton's house in Lenox, 2 tables pushed together in the dining room. Catherine had set out the good china, the kind you only use when you're trying to make something feel civilized, that doesn't feel civilized at all. Julian and I passed dishes without making eye contact. Our hands would briefly occupy the same serving bowl, his reaching mine withdrawing, like watching a hostage exchange. Careful hands, no eye contact. The object is more neutral territory than the space between us. Stephanie talked to Catherine about Boston marketing trends. Her voice is slightly too loud, too bright. The kind of deliberate cheerfulness people use when they're trying to fill silence with anything except what everyone's actually thinking about. Before dinner, Tyler found me on the living room couch. 7 years old, serious face. Reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. The foundation stone, the one he'd picked up from the gravel drive on Memorial Day, 6 months ago. "Grandpa," he said, "I kept it since that day." I took it from his small hand. I took it seriously. I turned it over. I felt the weight. "That's a good stone, Tyler," I said. "Strong one." "I carry it everywhere," he said, "in case I need it." "In case you need it for what?" He shrugged, the way 7-year-olds shrug when they know something matters but can't explain why. I handed it back. He put it carefully in his pocket, patted it once to make sure it was secure. During dinner, Chloe sat beside me, 9 years old, Clara's perceptive eyes and a face still learning how to hide what it understood. She leaned close and whispered, "Grandpa, are you and Dad in a fight?" "A disagreement, sweetheart," I said quietly. "About Clara's house." "About a lot of things, honey." She was 9 years old and already understood that adults could disagree about a lot of things while sitting 3 feet apart eating turkey. That kind of understanding shouldn't come this young. She nodded, went back to her mashed potatoes, didn't ask anything else. After dinner and pie, I stepped out onto Russell's back porch. Needed air, needed distance from the careful conversation and the things nobody was saying. The Taconic Mountains stood dark against the evening sky. The same mountains Clara and I used to look at from the overlook when we needed to think. Russell followed me out, stood beside me for a minute without speaking. "Then Arthur, you could give Julian a portion. Smooth this over. He's your son." I turned to my brother-in-law, held up both hands in the November cold. Swollen knuckles, joints that would never fully bend again. The physical record of 22 months is visible even in the dim porch light. "Russell," I said, "do you know how long I worked on that property?" He shook his head. 22 months. Every morning before the mist lifted off the mountains. Every evening until I couldn't trust my hands in fading light. Alone. Every single day. With these hands. I held them up higher, made sure he could see them clearly. These hands are giving out. The arthritis it's taking them. That house was the last major work they'll ever do. The last thing I'll ever build. Russell looked at my hands. Really looked at them. Saw the swelling, the stiffness, the joints that wouldn't straighten completely anymore. "Julian stood in that house for 45 seconds and called it a stone tomb," I continued. "Then 6 months later I hired a lawyer to demand half of what I received for it, based on a claim that's factually false. After trying to bribe Leland to testify, I was mentally incompetent." Russell nodded slowly. "I'm not giving him a portion," I said quietly. "Not to smooth this over. Not because he's my son. Not for any reason." Russell stood there another moment, then went back inside without another word about compromise. I stayed on the porch alone. The cold made my hands ache worse. Always did. The arthritis responded to temperature like a barometer. Every degree drop meant more pain, more stiffness. But it took longer than it used to before I had to go back inside. I stood there thinking about Tyler carrying that foundation stone in his pocket for 6 months. About Chloe asking if we were in a fight and already knowing the answer before I said it. About Julian sitting 15 feet away eating turkey and passing dishes and not saying a single word to me. About campaigns that don't stop until someone wins or someone breaks. About the fact that legal documents from 1987 could prove ownership but couldn't repair what was broken between a father and son. About Clara's notebook still sitting on my kitchen table, still mostly unread, still waiting for whatever moment would make me ready to read the rest. The porch door opened behind me. "Catherine." "Arthur," she said gently. "Coffee's ready if you want some." "Thank you," I said. "I'll be in shortly." She went back inside. I looked at my hands one more time in the porch light, flexed them slowly, felt the pain and the stiffness and the limitation. These hands had touched 12,000 stones. had built the last house they'd ever build, had earned every dollar Marcus Sterling had paid for that work, and Julian would get none of it. 3 weeks later, that legal certainty arrived by email. Legal victories arrive by email with formal language and case numbers, but the wars that follow them, the social media, post the friends who stop calling the winter silence. Those arrive without announcement and leave no paper trail. Mid-December, Everett sent a single email with an attachment. Withdrawal notice from Pierce & Associates. Attorney Evelyn Pierce had formally withdrawn from Julian's case. The language was professional, but clear. After carefully reviewing the financial evidence provided by the defendant, I cannot, in good conscience, continue to represent my client in this matter. She discovered the lie. Julian had told her the land was co-owned marital property, had claimed Clara's contribution entitled him to half, had provided false information to build a case that looked legitimate until someone actually examined the 1987 to 1989 bank records. 3 days. It took 3 days after losing the lawsuit for Stephanie to start the social media campaign Julian couldn't win in court. 20 minutes after Everett's email, my phone rang. "Arthur," he said, "it's done. You're legally 100% safe now." "Julian won't stop," I said. A pause on the line. "I know," Everett said quietly. "But legally, he's out of ammunition. She found out he lied about the land ownership. That's why she withdrew. No reputable attorney will touch this case once they see the documentation." I hung up, sat at my kitchen table. Legally safe, but I knew my son better than that. 3 days later, Stephanie started posting on social media. Never named me directly. Just words. Careful words that spread through mutual friend networks like smoke through a house. Ungrateful. Toxic. Some people don't deserve second chances. Family betrayal leaves scars that never heal. Social media posts are designed to look like personal reflection when they're really public prosecution, vague enough to deny specific enough that everyone knows exactly who you mean. Some people called, not knowing what to say, speaking carefully, asking if I was okay. "Arthur, I don't know what to say. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I'd tell them. "Thank you for calling." Others stop calling altogether. Before I show you the aftermath of that legal win, comment A, if you'd stay silent, or B, if you'd defend yourself. Add one reason in 5 to 10 words. Note, what follows includes some adapted details for storytelling. The truth behind it is what I hope stays with you. I posted nothing, offer no explanations, engaged with none of it. Evenings I sat at the kitchen table with Clara's notebook, reading a few more pages, still not to the end, but closer. The Berkshire's winter arrived early that year. First snow fell on December 15th. I sat watching it through the kitchen window, coffee cooling in my hand, and felt a silence I hadn't felt before. Heavier than last year's silence after Clara died, but not the bad kind of heavy. Different. The kind that comes when you've set something down and your hands remember the weight, but your shoulders don't. I'd carried the burden of that house for 22 months, carried it through Julian's dismissal, through his lawsuit, through his campaign. Now it is done. The house belonged to Marcus Sterling. The trust belonged to Chloe. The legal case was closed. The social media posts would fade eventually. They always do when people find newer drama to talk about. And I sat in my kitchen watching December snow fall on the property where Clara's house used to stand. Clara's notebook lay open on the table. I'd read another 3 pages that evening, her handwriting, her thoughts about the house we'd planned to restore together, about legacy, about what we leave behind. She'd written about Chloe, about how children see things adults miss, about how 9-year-olds understand value in ways that can't be taught, only recognized. I closed the notebook, placed my hand on the worn leather cover. The phone didn't ring much anymore. Some friends stayed, some didn't. That's how these things work. Crisis sorts people into categories you didn't know existed until you needed to know. Late December turned into January. The snow kept falling. The Berkshire's winter settled in with the kind of cold that makes your joints ache and your breath visible, and your house feel smaller than it is. I worked in my shop when my hands allowed it. Small projects. Things that didn't require the grip strength I used to have. Refinishing a cutting board for Catherine. Repairing a drawer for Leland. Things I could still do. Things that reminded me I could still make something, even if I couldn't build houses anymore. The silence in my house wasn't lonely. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you fought the fight that needed fighting and lived through it, and found yourself still standing on the other side. I remembered that winter by 2 things. The first snow on December 15th, and the doorbell that rang on a Tuesday evening at the end of February. The snow I'd expected. The doorbell and the 9-year-old girl standing alone on my porch, holding a folded piece of paper, while her mother waited in the car at the end of the driveway. I hadn't expected at all. I opened the door. Chloe stood on my porch in the February snow, holding a manila envelope. 9 years old. Serious face. Snow melting on her coat, and in her dark hair, Clara's hair. Clara's eyes looking up at me. Behind her at the end of my driveway, Stephanie's car idled with headlights on, waiting. "Grandpa," Chloe said, "can I come in? I have something to show you." "Of course, sweetheart." She stepped inside, stamped snow off her boots on the mat. I took her coat and hung it on the hook by the door. "Are you hungry?" I asked. "I could make hot chocolate," she asked hopefully. "Hot chocolate," I confirmed. She settled at the kitchen table, the same table Clara and I had used for 28 years, while I heated milk on the stove. Made it the way Clara used to make it. Real cocoa, sugar, a pinch of salt, not from a packet. I set the mug in front of Chloe. She wrapped her small hands around it, blew on it 3 times soft breaths that made the surface ripple. The sound stopped me. Clara used to do that, exactly that. 3 soft breaths. I'd watched her do it 1,000 times. I watched her do it 28 years ago when she was pregnant with Julian, sitting at this same table in our first apartment, drinking hot chocolate on winter evenings while we planned our future. Chloe took a careful sip, set the mug down, pulled the manila envelope toward her. "I won something," she said. "What did you win?" "First prize, state competition for an essay." "That's wonderful, Chloe. What was the essay about?" She opened the envelope, pulled out several pages. The top page had an official seal, Massachusetts State Board of Education, first place grades 4 to 6 essay category. "The topic was someone you admire," she said. "I wrote about you." I sat down across from her. "About me. About you building Clara's house. I watched you work sometimes. Remember Mom would drive me past when you were there?" I remembered. Stephanie driving past during the restoration, slowing down but never stopping. Chloe's face in the back window watching. "Can I read you the part that won?" Chloe asked. I nodded. She found the page, cleared her throat, read in her careful 9-year-old voice. "My grandfather built a whole house by himself. Every stone, every board, every window. It took him almost 2 years, and he did it alone, even though his hands hurt from arthritis. I think about what that must feel like, carrying a very heavy load for a very long time. Then when you finally put it down, the other person just walks past, like it was never heavy at all. My grandfather taught me that some people see the weight and some people don't. The ones who see it are the ones worth knowing." She looked up at me. I couldn't speak. A 9-year-old girl had just put into words what I couldn't say myself, had crystallized 2 years of my life into a metaphor about weight and seeing and value. I'd built that house to prove my skill to a son who never asked for proof. And now that son's daughter saw me clearly without needing any evidence at all. "Grandpa," Chloe said softly, "are you okay?" I wasn't okay. I was breaking. Not the bitter breaking I'd felt during the lawsuit. Not the angry breaking when Julian demanded half of what I'd earned. This was different. Cathartic. I cried for the first time since Clara's funeral. Not quiet tears. Real crying. The kind that shakes your shoulders and makes you forget to breathe right. Chloe got up from her chair, came around the table, put her small arms around me. "It's okay, Grandpa," she whispered. "It's okay." We sat like that for a while. Her hugged me trying to remember how to stop crying. The hot chocolate is cooling on the table. Eventually I found my breath again, found my voice. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you for writing that. Thank you for seeing it." "I see you, Grandpa," she said simply. "I always have." 20 minutes later, she put her coat back on. I walked her to the door. Stephanie's headlights were still there, patient waiting. Chloe hugged me one more time, then ran through the snow to her mother's car. I watched the taillights disappear down my driveway, watched until they turned onto the main road and vanished. Then I went back inside, stood in my kitchen for a long moment, walked to the drawer where I'd placed Clara's notebook months ago, took it out, sat down at the table. For the first time since finding it in that stone wall, I read it all the way through. Every page, every word, not skimming, not stopping. Clara's handwriting, her thoughts about the house we'd planned together, her hopes for what it would become, her observations about our son, about legacy, about what we leave behind. The last page contained one sentence. If you've read this far, Arthur, you've already let go of what needed letting go. Now, live. I closed the notebook. I placed it in the kitchen drawer, not hiding it, not avoiding it, just setting it down. The burden I'd carried since Clara's death, the need to prove something to justify my choices to hold on to the hurt Julian had caused, finally released. I'd built the house. I'd sold it for what it was worth. I'd protected Chloe's future. I'd survived Julian's campaign. And a 9-year-old girl had given me the words I needed to understand what it all meant. Carrying a heavy load for a very long time, then putting it down. I put it down. February turned into March. March turned into April. And in April the phone rang. Julian. Not about lawyers or money. I answered on the second ring. I heard my son's voice stripped of every recorded note. Just raw fear saying Dad, like Tyler might have said it at 7. Dad, Tyler broke his arm at school. I'm at the hospital. Stephanie's at a conference, won't be back for 2 hours. He stopped. Couldn't finish the sentence. Dad's coming, I said. Hung up. Grabbed my jacket. I was in the truck before I'd thought about what I was doing. Berkshire Medical Center was 20 minutes away. I made it in 15. Found them in the emergency department. Julian standing against the wall, hands in his pockets, looking lost. Tyler is sitting on an examination table, with a nurse trying to be brave. Grandpa... Tyler saw me first, his face crumpled with relief. Look, you can see the bone on the picture. He pointed to the x-ray on the light board. Clean fracture, radius just above the wrist. This was the first time Julian had called me Dad without wanting something in 2 years. Had called because he needed help, not because he wanted money or property or validation. Just needed his father. Hey, buddy, I said to Tyler. That's quite a break. What happened? Fell off the monkey bars, Tyler said, trying not to cry. It hurts. I know it does, but they're going to fix you up. Dr. Warren Harrison came, and then gray-haired orthopedic specialist who'd been working at this hospital for 30 years. He examined Tyler's arm with efficient kindness, explained the cast, explained the healing process, made Tyler laugh once with a joke about monkeys. Julian stood in the corner, silent, watching. We'll get him set up, Dr. Harrison said. Cast will take about an hour to properly set. You folks can wait in the room down the hall. As they wheeled Tyler toward the casting room, Julian finally spoke. I don't have a car today, or... He stopped. I looked at the floor. Let's get him a cast first, I said quietly. We'll figure out the rest after. We sat in the blue waiting room, blue vinyl chairs, fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic and old coffee, the particular hum that hospitals have machinery and ventilation, and the sound of people waiting for news. The blue vinyl chairs reminded me of the waiting room where Clara got her diagnosis. Same smell, same hum. Different ending this time. Julian sat beside me, not across from me, beside me. We didn't talk about the house. Didn't talk about the lawsuit. Didn't talk about the social media posts or the money or the 2 years of silence. We just sat. After 40 minutes, Tyler was brought back out. Cast on his arm, brave smile on his face, exhausted. Can I sleep? He asked. You can sleep? I said. He climbed onto the chairs, put his head on my lap. I fell asleep within minutes. Julian and I sat there for another hour while the cast fully set. Tyler is sleeping. My hand rested on his shoulder. Julian was staring at nothing. I didn't ask about the car. Didn't ask why he'd said and stopped. I didn't need to. I could see it in the way he held himself. In a careful way, he wasn't saying things. He'd been fired 3 weeks ago. I had no car. I had no money. The confident man who'd hired private investigators and attorneys and tried to bribe witnesses had collapsed economically. Was sitting in a hospital waiting room, unable to drive his injured son home. Dr. Harrison came out eventually. I looked at Tyler sleeping on my lap. I looked at Julian sitting beside me. Looked at both of us for a long moment. Nodded once. Said nothing. I didn't need to. He'd seen enough in 30 years to recognize what he was looking at. A father and son, a sleeping child, a silent reconciliation happening in blue vinyl chairs. In the parking lot, Julian confirmed what I already knew. I don't have the car, he said. Stephanie took it to the conference. I was going to take a ride share, but I'll drive you, I said. Thank you. 2 words. No performance. No justification. Just thank you. I carried Tyler to my truck. He barely woke up. Just mumbled something and fell back asleep against my shoulder while I buckled him into the back seat. Julian climbed into the passenger side. We drove in silence. After 10 minutes, Tyler woke up slightly. I looked around, confused. Grandpa, I'm here, buddy. We're taking you home. Is Clara's house home now? He asked. Sleep-thick voice. 7-year-old logic trying to make sense of where things were. I glanced in the rearview mirror, caught Julian's face, waiting for my answer. Yes, I said. Someone's taking care of her. Good, Tyler mumbled. I fell back asleep. In the rearview mirror, I watched Julian. Not the courtroom face, not the performance, just my son. 32 years old and lost, staring at the cast on his sleeping child's arm. We pulled into Julian's apartment complex 20 minutes later. I saw it before Julian did. The eviction notice on the door. Red paper, official seal, dated for the end of April. 3 weeks away. The envelope in my mailbox had no return address, but I recognized the handwriting before I even pulled it free. Stephanie's careful, slanted cursive that matched the birthday card she'd sent the kids when they were younger. May 17th. 3 weeks since Tyler's arm, 2 weeks since Julian moved into Clara's house's guest room, with a duffel bag and a look that said he'd run out of options. I opened it standing there by the road. Arthur, it began. No dear, just my name like she was sitting across from me. I've been thinking about Clara's house since Tyler's accident. Julian told me you let them stay, no questions. I didn't know he'd lost his job. I didn't know about the eviction. Maybe I should have. The paper was cream-colored expensive, the kind Stephanie always used for thank-you notes. I drove past the house last week. I didn't stop. I wasn't ready. But I saw the porch you built, the shutters, the garden boxes that must be Clara's design because they look like something she would have loved. I've been angry at that house for 2 years, angry at you for choosing it over Julian, but standing there on Oak Ridge, I realized I was wrong. You weren't choosing the house. You were choosing Clara. And maybe that's what Julian needed to see all along, what it looks like when someone doesn't give up. My hands were shaking. I read it again, then a third time. I can't apologize for the lawsuit. Julian was hurting, and I thought I was protecting him. But I can apologize for not seeing what you were building, not the house, the memory. The proof that love doesn't end when someone dies. Tyler asks about Clara now. He wants to know if she likes strawberries, if she knew how to whistle, if she would have taught him to build things. Julian doesn't stop him anymore. The letter ended with a single line. Thank you for catching him when he fell. No signature. Just a blank space where her name should have been like she couldn't quite commit to the reconciliation but couldn't stay silent either. I folded the letter and put it in my shirt pocket. Then I walked up the driveway to the workshop where Julian's truck was parked beside mine. He'd started showing up in the mornings, 7:30, sometimes earlier, never asking permission, just appearing with coffee and a thermos, and that same look he used to have at 16 when he'd wanted to learn how to change his oil, but was too proud to admit he didn't know. He was inside, standing by the workbench where I'd laid out the wood for a bookshelf commission, cherry already planted smooth on 3 sides. He touched it carefully, fingertips tracing the grain. Mornin', I said. He nodded, picked up his coffee, set it down again. Can you show me how to do that? The planning. I'd been waiting for this question for 2 weeks, ever since he'd walked into the workshop the first time and just stood there looking at Clara's old tools on the wall, like they were museum pieces. Have you ever used a hand plane? I asked. He shook his head. I pulled one from the rack, a number 4, my most forgiving. It's all about the angle, I said, fitting it into his hands. Too steep, you'll gouge. Too shallow, you'll skate. You want to feel the blade bite just enough to peel the wood, not tear it. He positioned himself at the bench, awkward, uncertain. I adjusted his stance feet, wider shoulders, loose weight forward. The first pass took off nothing. The second caught an edge and stuttered. The third produced a thin curl of cherry that spiraled onto the floor like a wood ribbon. He stared at it, then on the plane, then at me. It's like flying, I said. You don't muscle it, you guide it. We worked for 2 hours. June light came through the window and turned the sawdust gold. He asked about grain direction, blade depth, whether different woods needed different pressure. I answered each question the way my father had answered mine, showing not telling, letting the wood teach what words couldn't. Around 9:30, Tyler appeared in the doorway. His cast was covered in marker drawings, dinosaurs' trucks, a wobbly house that might have been Clara's. He watched his father make another pass, with the plane producing a curl twice as long as the first. Cool, Tyler said. Julian smiled, actually smiled. The first real one I'd seen since the hospital. Here's the thing about woodworking. It doesn't care about your resume. Doesn't care if you lost your job or your house or 2 years to anger. It only cares if you're willing to learn the angle, feel, the grain, respect the material. Julian was learning. Slowly, carefully, like a man remembering how to trust his hands. When Tyler wandered back outside to explore the scrap pile, Julian set down the plane and looked at me directly. Can I come back next Saturday? I thought about Stephanie's letter in my pocket, about Tyler asking if Clara liked strawberries, about the way Julian's shoulders had finally dropped from his ears after that third successful pass. The workshop opens at 8, I said. He nodded, started to leave, stopped at the door. Dad, his voice was quiet. The letter Mom sent you, she told me she was writing it. I wanted you to know it wasn't my idea. But I'm glad she did it. He left before I could respond. I stood there in the sawdust and summer light, listening to his truck pull away, and pulled out Stephanie's letter one more time. Reread that last line. Thank you for catching him when he fell. Except she'd gotten it backwards. He was the one catching me. Julian showed up the next Saturday at 7:50, and the Saturday after that. And by mid-July, I stopped being surprised to hear the workshop door at 8 sharp. He never called ahead. Just appeared with that same thermos of coffee and stood by the workbench, waiting for instruction. We didn't talk much those first weeks. I'd set out a project drawer, pulls a cutting board, a simple frame, and show him once. After that, I let the wood do the teaching. There's a point where instruction becomes interference, where you have to trust the material to say what words can't. By August, he could read a board, not well, but he could read it, could tell where the grain would tear, where a knot would fight the blade. Calluses formed on his fingertips, the kind you only get from hand tools from pushing a chisel until your skin remembers the shape. But what I noticed most was the phone. First few Saturdays, he kept it in his pocket, checking between cuts. Job listings, probably. That compulsive scrolling when you're afraid of silence. Then sometime in late June, he started leaving it in the truck. By July, it stayed there all morning. By August, I don't think he remembered it existed. Here's the thing about teaching your son versus teaching strangers. With strangers, you show technique. Proper grip, correct angle, where to put your weight. With your son, you're trying to teach him how to be still, long enough to hear what the wood says first. How to quiet the noise that's been telling him he's not good enough, didn't measure up, failed. Julian wasn't learning carpentry. He was learning how to listen to something other than his own panic. I realized sometime in August that his hands looked different. Not just the calluses, though. Those were their rough patches where he gripped the plane. It was the way he held tools, like he was asking permission instead of taking. Like the chisel might tell him no, and he'd accept that answer. Tyler came most Saturdays building kingdoms in the scrap pile. Chloe came twice, quieter, more deliberate. She'd watch Julian work for 15 minutes without speaking, then ask a question that proved she'd been studying the whole time. Why does that wood curl when Daddy planes it? Smart kid. Clara would have loved her. September came with cool mornings and golden light that made sawdust glow. Julian finished his first real project, a small shelf for Tyler's rocks. The joints were tight, the finish even. He stood back and looked at it for a long time. It's crooked, he said. Everything's crooked, I told him. Build enough, you learn to make crooked look intentional. The call came from Chloe's school on a Thursday. Family Day, second week of September. Cultural Historical Studies competition. Would I like to attend, Chloe had asked specifically. I said yes before they finished the question. The gymnasium smelled like poster board and floor wax. 30-some projects on folding tables, parents circling with phones out. Chloe's was in the far corner, and I saw it before I saw her. A model. Fieldstone foundation, maybe 18 inches across, built from stream stones and clay mortar. The technique was old, 1890s, the kind Berkshire masons used before concrete became cheap. The placard said she'd sourced historical documents from county archives, studied mortar composition, tested 3 different clay mixtures. Julian was already there with Stephanie. He looked up when I approached, nodded, stepped aside to make room. Grandpa, Chloe grabbed my hand. Do you like it? I used the stones from behind your workshop. I hope that's okay? More than okay, I said. A man in a gray suit stopped beside us. Mid-50s, rimless glasses, architect's posture. He studied the model, then looked at Chloe. Remarkable work, he said. Then to me, you must be Arthur Vance. I must have looked confused because he smiled and extended his hand. Marcus Sterling, I wrote about your wife's house 2 years ago, the architectural journal piece. The school invited me to judge the competition. He turned back to Chloe's model. She has natural talent, the attention to historical accuracy, the material choice. Most students her age don't think about why a technique was used, just that it was. She's asking the right questions. He moved on. Julian stared at Chloe's model in long silence, the kind that meant he was thinking something he didn't know how to say yet. The drive home was quiet. 20 minutes of September fields and afternoon light, Julian's hands on the wheel. Finally, almost to my driveway, he spoke. Dad, have I built anything yet? I thought about the shelf, the cutting board, the frame still drying in the workshop. Not yet, I said. I think that's the problem. His voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear. Chloe built that whole model by herself, 9 years old, and I've spent 32 years taking things apart, breaking things down, demanding my share. But I've never built anything. He pulled into my driveway, put the truck in park, didn't move. Your mother built a house, I said. Your daughter built a model. You can build something too. He left after that. I went inside, made dinner, tried to read. But around 9, I saw the workshop light on from the kitchen window. Julian's truck still in the driveway. He was standing in front of the cherry boards I'd milled last spring, running his hand along the grain. One in particular held his attention tight. Grain no knots, the kind of board that only comes from old-growth trees, that don't exist anymore. He looked back at me standing in the doorway. Can I buy this one from you? I shook my head. Take it. Build something. I set 2 plates on the kitchen table without asking if Julian would stay, and Julian sat down without asking if he was invited. First time in 2 years. Maybe longer. I couldn't remember the last meal we'd shared in this house before Clara died. I made pasta. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti with the sauce Clara used to make from her garden tomatoes. The recipe I'd canned last summer out of habit more than hope. Julian ate without speaking. Not tense silence, not the kind we'd lived in for years, just quiet. The comfortable kind you only get with people who've stopped trying to fill space with words. After I cleared the plates, rinsed them in the sink, stood there longer than I needed to, hands wet, looking out the window at the workshop. The light was still on from earlier. I could see the cherry board on the bench waiting. I dried my hands and opened the drawer by the stove, the one with the pot holders and takeout menus and things that don't have another home. Clara's notebook was underneath, right where I'd kept it since I found it during the restoration. I'd almost read it aloud 100 times, rehearsed the words to empty air, practicing for a son who wasn't there. Now Julian was here 10 feet away at my kitchen table, and my hands shook opening the cover. I placed it on the table between us. The leather was worn smooth corners, soft from handling. Clara's handwriting on the first page, neat and deliberate, last will and testament, handwritten, witnessed by notary, September 2019. Do you want to hear it? I asked. Julian looked at the notebook, looked at me, nodded once, didn't speak. I sat down and read. To Julian, my son, the land I bought in 1987 was purchased with money I earned myself from my work at the Berkshire Historical Society. Your father has said this makes the house mine in some legal sense, but that was never how we thought of it. Arthur compensated me in full through 40 years of partnership care and the kind of daily love that doesn't come with receipts. I wanted you to know that. I wanted to thank him for it here, where you might see it someday. My voice caught on her name. I kept reading. The house is not meant to be inherited as property. It's meant to be a place where family can meet, if that's still possible. I don't know if it's still possible, Julian. I don't know if you and your father will ever stand in the same room again without anger between you. But I want to try. I want to build something that might outlast the hurt. I stopped, looked up. Julian was staring down at the table jaw, tight hands flat on the wood. And then I saw it, tears, silent, running down his face and dropping onto the pine surface Clara had refinished 30 years ago. The first tears I'd seen from my son since the funeral. Maybe the first real ones since she died. I kept reading through the blur in my own eyes. Arthur will restore this house because that's who he is. He'll make it beautiful because he doesn't know how to do things halfway. But I'm asking him to restore it for a reason. So there's a place where you can bring your children, where they can learn their grandmother lived and loved and built things with her hands. Where maybe, if we're very lucky, you and your father can learn to be in the same room without one of you leaving. The next page was instructions, structural details, historical preservation notes, the things Clara cared about. I didn't read those aloud. The last page was a single line. This house is my hope that love can be built, not just inherited, that you can choose to come home even when no one makes you. I'm building this hope for you, Julian. Please don't let it stay empty. I closed the notebook. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a car passed on the road, headlights sweeping across the ceiling. Julian didn't move, didn't wipe his face, just sat there with his hands on the table and his mother's words hanging in the air between us. 10 o'clock came and went. Finally, Julian stood, pushed his chair back carefully like he was afraid of breaking something, picked up his keys from the counter. "Thanks for dinner," he said, voice rough, barely there. He walked to the door, stopped, turned back like he wanted to say something else. Didn't. Just nodded once and left. I stayed at the table with Clara's notebook, listening to his footsteps on the gravel. The truck door opened, closed, but the engine didn't start. I got up and looked out the kitchen window. Julian was standing in the workshop doorway, just standing there backlit by the motion sensor light, looking in at the tools on the walls and the workbench, and the cherry board still lying where he'd left it. He stood there for 1 minute, 2, 5, not moving, just looking like he was trying to see something that wasn't visible yet. When he finally walked back to his truck and got in, he sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. I could see his silhouette through the windshield, head down, hands on the wheel. Clara's words echoed in my head. If that's still possible, I don't know if it's still possible. Through the window, I could see the workshop calendar on the wall. September almost gone, October, starting next week. Thanksgiving was 8 weeks away. 8 weeks to build something. 8 weeks to find out if Clara's hope was just words in a notebook, or something that could be made real with wood and time and 2 men who'd forgotten how to be father and son. Julian's truck finally started, pulled out of the driveway. Taillights disappeared down the road. I stood there in the sawdust and summer light, looking at the bench where he left his work, a small box made of cherry wood with clean practice joints. The workshop light stayed on waiting. The second Thanksgiving felt different from the first 14 people instead of strained silence. Julian arriving early instead of late warmth instead of performance. He'd spent those 8 weeks in my workshop building a dining table from the cherry board, working alone when I wasn't there, staying late when I was. We didn't talk much during those October Saturdays, just worked side by side, him learning mortise and tenon joints, while I finished Chloe's writing desk. By the time November came, he'd built something real with his own hands, something Clara would have been proud of. Russell Thornton's house in Lenox smelled like roasted turkey, and Catherine's homemade rolls, the kind that made the whole place feel like someone actually lived there instead of just decorating it. Russell, Clara's younger brother, had hosted Thanksgiving for the family since she died, his way of keeping us together when we were all falling apart. Catherine, his wife of 30 years, moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, making sure everything ran smoothly without anyone feeling managed. Julian showed up at 2 an hour before dinner, found Russell in the basement gathering folding chairs, and just started carrying them up without being asked. No announcement, no making sure anyone saw him helping. Just picked up 3 chairs and headed for the stairs like it was the most natural thing in the world. I watched from the kitchen doorway. Stephanie noticed too. She was setting the table with Catherine, and she caught my eye across the room, offered a small smile that wasn't tight at the edges this time. Not the performance smile from last year, just acknowledgement that something had shifted. Last Thanksgiving. Julian had arrived 2 hours late with apologies that sounded rehearsed. Stephanie's smile had been careful, protective. The children too quiet reading the room, the way kids do when they know the adults are pretending. Everyone performing family instead of being it. That dinner had tasted like obligation and unspoken accusations, no matter how good Catherine's cooking was. This year, Chloe presented her Keystone Arch model to the whole table during dinner. No one asked her to. She just wanted to. Explain the physics of how compression turns weight into strength, how the center stone holds everything together, not by being strongest, but by being shaped exactly right. Tyler interrupted twice to add that he'd helped find some of the stones. Russell listened like she was presenting a doctoral thesis. Stephanie passed me the cranberry sauce halfway through the meal. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're welcome," I said. That was all, but it was enough. After dinner, I found myself on Russell's back porch. Same spot as last year. November, cold Taconic mountains going gray and the distant smell of wood smoke drifting up from somewhere down the valley. I was thinking about Clara, about whether she could see this her brother's house full of family, her grandchildren laughing inside, her son carrying chairs without being asked. The door opened behind me. Julian stepped out, closing it carefully against the warmth inside. He stood beside me at the railing, didn't say anything for a minute, just looked at the mountain's hands in his pockets, breath fogging in the cold. "Dad," he said finally, "I know I hurt you, not just the house. Haven't seen you clearly for a long time. What you do, what you know, what that requires. I put a lone structure I'm proud of in front of a house you built with hands. Didn't think which one really mattered." His apology was like his first clean cut with the hand playing no flash, no performance, just the thing done right, because he finally understood the grain. "I don't need a speech," I told him. "Just need you to show up." "I know," he said. "I'm doing that." We stood there in the cold. Wood smoke and distant voices from inside Catherine laughing at something Russell said, Tyler's higher voice, asking for more pie. "What are you building for Chloe?" Julian asked. "Writing desk," I said. "For her room. Figured she's earned it with that model." "Can I help?" I looked at him. His face was serious, hopeful. Same expression he used to have at 8 years old, when he wanted to help me fix the porch railing, but wasn't sure if I'd let him. "You're good enough to sand," I said, "and hold things steady while I cut." He laughed. The real laugh, the one from childhood, not the careful boardroom version he'd developed somewhere in his 20s. The kind of laugh that came from your chest, unguarded, the sound of a man who'd found his way back to himself through building something with his hands, instead of managing other people's money. It was the sound I'd been waiting 2 years to hear. "Fair enough," he said, still smiling. "I can sand." We stood there a minute longer, not needing to fill the silence with more words. Inside, someone was cutting pie. Tyler called for his father. Julian turned toward the door, and I followed. That's when I saw her. Chloe standing at the window beside the door, watching, her 9-year-old face serious and hopeful, pressed close to the glass. She'd been there the whole time, watching our conversation through the window, like she was waiting for something specific to happen. When she saw us coming, she ran to the door and pulled it open before we could reach for the handle. "Grandpa," she said, looking between us, "are you coming in for pie?" "Yes, I said." She smiled, then bright and relieved, like she'd been holding her breath and could finally let it out. Like she'd been waiting to see if the adults could do what she already knew was possible, come back together without breaking again. Julian ruffled her hair as we walked past. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the dining room, talking about the writing desk she'd heard us mention, asking if it would have drawers, if she could pick the wood stain, if there was room for a secret compartment. I followed them inside into the warmth and the noise and the smell of pumpkin pie, and thought about Clara's words in her notebook. I don't know if it's still possible. It was possible. She'd built the hope. We'd built the rest. The Monday after Thanksgiving, Julian showed up at the workshop with a sketch on graph paper. Chloe's writing desk dimensions calculated for a 9-year-old who would grow. He'd been thinking about it all weekend, he said, working out the proportions, making sure it would last. Chloe's hopeful face at that window had stayed with both of us, the way she'd been watching, waiting to see if we could come back together without breaking again. This desk was our answer to that question. Not words, but something built to last. We laid out the design together on my workbench. White oak for the frame and top cherry trim along the drawer fronts. Simple lines, nothing fancy. Small enough for her room now, but built to grow with her desk height, adjustable proportions that would make sense whether she was 9 or 19. "She'll outgrow it," Julian said, studying the measurements. "Not if we build it right," I told him. "Desk grows with the kid if you think ahead." I pulled boards from the rack, white oak I'd been saving for something worth the wait. Julian ran his hands over them, checking for warp, feeling the grain, measured the first board twice, then a third time. I watched his hands move careful, thorough, willing to take the time to get it right. Saw Clara's patience in the way he held the tape measure, how he double-checked his pencil marks before committing to the cut. She'd taught him that once when he was maybe 12 and building a birdhouse. Measure twice, cut once. He'd forgotten it for a while, but the muscle memory was still there. Ready? I asked. He nodded. We cut the first pieces together, me at the saw, him holding the board steady. The blade bit through oak, and the workshop filled with that clean smell of fresh-cut wood sawdust, catching the afternoon light through the window. Julian sanded for 3 sessions. Not rushed, not impatient. Just steady, methodical work, with progressively finer grits, until the oak was smooth as silk under your palm. He'd show up Saturday mornings with coffee and get right to it. No small talk, no checking his phone. Just him and the wood and the rhythm of the sanding block moving with the grain. I worked on drawer joints while he sanded. Dovetails for the corners, dados for the bottom panels. We didn't say much. There are times when silence is better than language, when the rasp of sandpaper and the tap of a mallet say more than words about 2 people who found their way back to each other. Here's what I realized sometime in that first week. Building Clara's house alone was me proving something. Proving I could finish what we started, prove I hadn't given up. Prove the marriage meant something after she was gone. But building this desk together with Julian, this was saying something. 2 different languages, 2 different purposes. One was about the past. The other was about what comes next. The silence between us wasn't tense anymore, wasn't loaded with all the things we couldn't say. It was companionable, the kind of quiet you only get when 2 people are working toward the same thing and don't need to explain it. We'd found a language in sawdust and joinery that 2 years of words and lawyers couldn't provide. By early December, the desk was taking shape. Drawers fitted and sliding smooth top, sanded and ready for finish. Julian had learned to read the grain, see where the wood wanted to go work with it instead of against it. Watched him fit the last drawer and realized he wasn't asking for my approval anymore. Just checked it. Himself felt the clearance, adjusted the fit until it was right. I pulled out my carving tools for the last detail. Smallest chisel, the one with the walnut handle Clara gave me for our 20th anniversary. Flipped the desk upside down on the bench and found the right corner, underside where no one sees from outside, where craftsmen usually sign their work. Julian watched me mark out the letters with a pencil. C-A-V. Why there, he asked, where no one will see it. She'll see it, I said. When she's older and turns it over to fix a wobbly leg or refinish the top, that's when she'll know who built it and why. I carved each letter carefully. Chloe Ann Vance. Full initials the way my father had signed his work the way his father had before him. Marking her as part of the lineage, part of the line of people who built things that lasted, who left their names where only the next generation would find them. Julian was quiet while I worked. When I finished, he ran his finger over the letters, feeling the depth of the cuts. She's part of it now, he said softly. Isn't she? Not a question, just acknowledgement. The reconciliation wasn't just between us anymore. It was extending forward to his daughter, to whatever she'd build with her own hands someday. We finished the desk 2 days before mid-December. Applied 3 coats of oil finish, buffed it until the oak glowed warm, and the cherry trim looked like it was lit from inside. The drawer pulls hand-forged iron from a smith in Great Barrington caught the winter light through the workshop window. We wrapped it in old quilts and set it in the corner. There it sat, waiting for Christmas, patient, ready. The week before Christmas, Julian came by to check on it. Pulled back the quilt corner, ran his hand over the top one more time, stepped back and just looked at it, at something he'd built with his own hands, something that would outlast both of us. He was quiet for a long time. Then, what happens to Clara's house now? I'd been waiting for this question, waiting for months, really, since the lawsuit settled, since the trust got established, since Julian first started showing up at the workshop. I had an answer ready, but it wasn't the one he expected. Come inside, I said. I'll put on coffee. We should talk about that. I was drinking morning coffee when Marcus Sterling's email arrived with a subject line that made me read it 3 times. Documentary invitation. Clara's house selected. I'd told Julian my answer about the house the week before. Told him my plan. He'd listened, nodded, then told me his. Different plans that somehow fit together, like dovetail. Joints his holding, mine in place, mine supporting his. But this email was something neither of us had expected. Marcus's message was characteristically precise. A documentary crew from Boston was filming a series about 19th century New England vernacular architecture, the buildings ordinary people made with local materials, and inherited knowledge before mass production standardized everything. They'd seen his architectural journal piece about Clara's house, read his analysis of the fieldstone foundation technique, the timber framing the way the whole structure sat in the landscape, like it had grown there instead of being imposed on it. They wanted to feature the house. More than that, they wanted me. I set down my coffee and read it again. The director was particularly interested in the restoration process Marcus wrote, how I'd matched the original stonework, how I'd sourced period-appropriate materials, how I'd used methods that were already rare when I learned them 40 years ago and were nearly extinct now. The term Marcus used stopped me cold technical witness. Not stonemason, not contractor, not even craftsman. Witness. Someone who could testify to a method that might otherwise disappear with him. Someone who'd seen how it was done and could pass that seeing forward before it became just photographs in an archive instructions nobody remembered how to follow. I thought about my father teaching me to read stone, which ones would hold weight, which would split under pressure, how to find the grain in granite. Thought about his father teaching him the same thing in the 1940s, learning from old masons who'd learned it in the 1890s. 4 generations of knowledge sitting in my hands every time I picked up a stone and knew where it belonged. How many people were left who knew this dozen less? Marcus's email continued. The filming would take 3 days in January. They'd document the foundation technique in detail, camera angles, slow-motion technical diagrams, archive quality footage for preservation societies and architecture schools. He'd recommended me as the only person he knew who could demonstrate the method properly. Then he wrote something that made my throat tight. This may be the only document remaining of this method. Your participation would be a significant contribution to architectural preservation. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, December, sun caught the frost on the workshop roof. The same workshop where my father taught me to plane wood, where I'd taught Julian just months ago, where Chloe's writing desk sat wrapped and waiting for Christmas. I remembered Clara watching me lay the foundation stones for the house 28 years ago. Early morning in 1997, before the work got serious, when it was still just clearing land and marking boundaries. She'd brought coffee in a thermos and sat on what would become the front step, watching me test stones for the corners. "Why do you bother?" she'd asked. "Concrete's faster, cheaper too." I couldn't explain it then. Couldn't find words for why some knowledge was worth the slowness, worth the aching back and split knuckles, worth doing it the hard way when the easy way was right there. I just knew that the old methods held something. The new ones didn't. Not better exactly, just different, irreplaceable. Clara had smiled at my fumbling explanation, said something I didn't understand until right now reading Marcus's email in my kitchen 15 years after she died. "What you love long enough will eventually find someone who loves it," she'd said. "You just have to keep loving it until they show up." I printed Marcus's email, walked to the refrigerator where Clara's photo hung with a magnet her 60th birthday, 2 months before the diagnosis, smiling in the garden with dirt on her hands and tomatoes in a basket. Stuck the printed email right next to it. Not pride exactly. More like answer to a question I didn't know I'd been asking all these years. What does legacy want? Not to be admired, not to be valuable, just to find someone who understands why it matters, someone who'll love it enough to keep it alive. The documentary wasn't choosing Clara's house because of the family drama or the lawsuit, or even because Marcus had written about it. They were choosing it for the craft itself, for the technique, for knowledge that deserved to outlive the man who held it. My legacy wasn't the conflict, it was the stone. Clara's prophetic words proved true standing there in the December kitchen. The stonework had found people who loved it. Marcus, the documentary director, whoever would watch the footage and learn from it, architecture students who'd study the method, preservation societies who'd archive the technique. Maybe someday another mason who'd watch the video and understand what these stones required. The knowledge would survive, not just in my hands, but documented, preserved, passed forward. I pulled out my phone and typed a reply to Marcus. One word, yes. Sent it. Stood there for a moment with Clara's photo and the printed email and the winter light coming through the window. Felt something settle that I didn't know had been restless. Then I walked out to the workshop. Good news, he asked. I nodded. The house is going to teach one more generation. He smiled, understood immediately what that meant. We'd talked about our plans for Clara's house last week, his idea and mine different, but fitting together. This documentary was something else entirely, but it served the same purpose. The house wasn't just property to inherit or a place to gather. It was a teacher. Always had been. Clara understood that before I did. She'd like that? Julian said quietly. Yes, she would. Christmas morning arrived with a crisp, low light that blanketed the Berkshires in silver. Inside the living room, the air was warm, rich with the scent of pine needles, and the cinnamon rolls Catherine had delivered the evening before. Tyler was already sitting cross-legged on the floor, buried beneath a small mountain of torn green wrapping paper, completely absorbed in constructing an elaborate fortress out of wooden blocks. Near the west window, Stephanie stood quietly with an old ceramic mug clamped between her palms, watching the soft flurry of snow dust the hemlock porch outside. There was a lightness in her posture that hadn't been there 2 winters ago. No defensive angles, no rehearsed poise. Just the calm stillness of someone who finally felt the ground beneath her feet. But Chloe wasn't looking at the small boxes or the bright ribbons. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the large object, tucked into the corner, near the fieldstone hearth. She walked toward it slowly, her boots whispering against the floorboards, and pulled the old utility quilts away. The white oak framework gleamed under the soft morning light, its surface buffed with linseed oil until it held a quiet luster. The cherry trim along the drawer tops offered a deep reddish contrast, running like a clean vein through the lighter wood. Chloe didn't say a word. She simply sat down on the small matching bench Julian had built, sliding her legs underneath the frame. Her hands came down flat against the desktop, her small fingers spreading wide to touch the wood grain. She moved her palms over the surface, feeling the seamless transition where the oak planks met, testing the glass-smooth finish we had spent hours perfecting. She looked across the room at me, her eyes dark and incredibly focused. "Did you build this, Grandpa?" "I cut the joints," I said, leaning against the door frame. "But your father did the real work." She turned her gaze to Julian, who was sitting on the edge of the brick hearth, his hands holding a cold cup of coffee. His knuckles were slightly raw, covered in the faint pale scars of rough sandpaper and chisel. Slips the honest marks of a man who had stopped running from silence. "I sanded it, Chloe," Julian said, his voice completely clear of the old artificial corporate weight. 3 separate times, from the roughest paper down to the kind that feels like cloth. I wanted to make sure there wasn't a single splinter left. Chloe didn't look for flaws. She looked for the weight of it. She pulled the top drawer open. The hand-forged iron ring clicked against the cherry face, a solid, heavy sound that resonated in the quiet room. The drawer glided along its hand-cut dado slot, without a single catch or wobble, opening fully to reveal the clean cedar bottom we'd chosen to keep her notebooks dry. She pushed it closed, listening to the soft wooden thunk as the hidden stops met the internal frame. "I will keep this forever," she said. It wasn't the excited exclamation of a child opening a toy. It was a statement of absolute certainty spoken with the same quiet gravity she'd used when she picked up that first foundation stone in the freezing mud 2 years ago. "I know you will, sweetheart," I replied. Stephanie walked over from the window, setting her mug down on the mantelpiece. She didn't look at the desk as a piece of rustic furniture or a design trend to be categorized for a Boston portfolio. She ran her fingertips along the white oak edge, then looked at Julian, her expression soft, almost wonderingly. She was seeing the physical proof of her husband's stillness, the evidence that a man could lose everything he thought defined him and find something entirely unbreakable in the dust of a workshop floor. "It's perfect, Julian," she whispered. Julian looked down at his coffee, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Dad showed me how to read the grain. If you don't watch the direction of the growth, rings the blade tears the surface instead of smoothing it. You have to follow what the tree did before you ever touched it." Chloe tilted her head, her dark hair falling over her shoulder, in that specific perceptive angle that always brought Clara back into the room. She was looking at the bottom edge of the desk carcass, her fingers exploring the underside of the main frame. "There's something carved underneath here," she murmured. "Let's turn it over," Julian said, setting his cup down. Carefully, father and son moved together. Julian took the heavy oak top, I took the base, and we rolled the desk onto its back on the thick wool rug. The winter sun caught the raw, hand-planed underside the parts the rest of the world would never see during a casual walkthrough. Chloe knelt in the sawdust that still clung to the rug, her face inches from the wood. In the far right corner, buried deep within the white oak grain where the leg met the apron, the clean, deep triangular cuts of my smallest carving tool were perfectly visible. C.A.V. Those are my initials, Chloe whispered, her finger tracing the inner walls of the letter A. Chloe Ann Vance. A stonemason leaves his mark on the stone that locks the wall, I told her, kneeling down beside her on the floor, and a carpenter leaves his name where the structure keeps it safe. Your great-grandfather signed his timber that way in the 30s. My father did it in the 50s. Now your name is in the wood. Am I part of the building now? She asked, looking up at me with Clara's unblinking eyes. You're the center of it, Julian said quietly, his hand coming down to rest on his daughter's shoulder. You're the reason we didn't stop. Chloe kept searching the underside, her eyes catching a faint line in the joinery that didn't match the standard structural lines. Directly behind the carved initials built into the thick block, used to reinforce the leg joint, was a tiny recessed slot. It was completely flush with the oak, hidden so perfectly that only someone cleaning the underside or dismantling the frame would ever notice the seam. She pressed her thumb against the small wooden panel. It shifted with a tiny click, sliding backward into a hidden pocket. Inside the tiny niche lay a heavy brass key attached to a solid silver chain and a small square of heavy parchment paper folded into a tight rectangle. Chloe pulled the key out by the chain, its weight clinking softly against her small palm. She unfolded the paper carefully, her eyes scanning the neat dark ink of my handwriting. "Read it, Grandpa," she said, handing the parchment to me. I held the small paper between my thick fingers. The arthritis was still there, a dull ache brought on by the December frost, but the trembling had stopped. I cleared my throat and read the words aloud into the warm room. For Chloe Ann Vance, when she turns 18. Leland Harding holds the ledger. He knows exactly what to do. Julian didn't look startled. He looked at the key, then looked at me, a slow nod of total understanding passing between us. He knew what that brass key represented. It didn't open a door to the stone house across the field, and it didn't hold a number that could save an investment firm or secure a bridge loan from a Boston bank. It was the key to the irrevocable trust Everett had drawn up in September, $700,000, protected by the ironclad signature of an old blacksmith who knew what it meant to carry a heavy load until the work was finished. The money would sit there in the dark for 9 more winters, growing quietly beneath the surface of the local bank, completely out of reach from anyone who might look at it as collateral or leverage. It would wait for a 9-year-old girl to become an 18-year-old woman, someone who already knew that a pile of rubble could be a foundation if you had the patience to read the stone. "What does it unlock, Grandpa?" Chloe asked, cradling the brass key in both hands. "A path," I said softly, reaching out to tuck her dark hair behind her ear. "A path your grandmother and I laid out for you before the walls ever went up. Keep it safe in your pocket, Chloe, the same way you kept that foundation stone." She nodded once, a solemn, deliberate movement, and immediately slipped the silver chain over her head, letting the heavy brass key drop beneath her holiday sweater until it rested cold against her chest. She didn't ask how much was in the trust or what the ledger contained. She didn't care about the numbers. She cared that the key had a purpose and that she was trusted to carry it. By noon, the rest of the family had arrived at my house. The small kitchen was full of steam and the clatter of silver. Russell Thornton was sitting at the table, his laughter booming through the hallway, as he told Tyler a story about an old masonry project from 1994, while Catherine moved between the stove and the counter, her hands busy carving the ham. Julian was in the center of it all. He wasn't standing in the corner anymore, checking a glowing screen or adjusting his cuffs with that tense defensive posture. He was listening to his Uncle Russell, his shoulders loose, his hands rough and stained with walnut dye, looking like a man who had finally come home because he wanted to be there, not because he had nowhere else to go. After dinner, the house grew quiet again as the afternoon sun dipped behind the Taconic Range, turning the snow outside a deep, pale violet. January was only a week away, bringing the cold that would make my joints lock and the film crew from Boston that would record the dry stone methods for the historical archives. The old stone house across the property would be featured on screens across New England, its walls studied by students who wanted to know how lime mortar could hold weight for another 100 years. But as I stood on the porch in the gathering dusk, watching the wind move through the pine trees Clara had loved, I knew the real preservation wasn't happening on film. The door behind me clicked open. Chloe stepped out onto the cold hemlock boards, her winter coat buttoned tight, the silver chain glinting slightly at her throat. She walked over to the edge of the porch and looked out at the snowy field behind the workshop. "Grandpa," she said, her breath forming a white cloud in the mountain air, "when the spring comes and the mud dries, will you show me how to lay the cornerstones?" I looked down at her steady hands, her serious eyes, her grandmother's quiet determination written into the line of her jaw. "I'll show you how to find the grain," I told her, my arm coming around her small shoulders to pull her close against the winter chill. "I'll show you how to read the weight before you ever lift it. But you'll have to do the stacking yourself." She smiled, her small fingers reaching into her pocket to touch the heavy key beneath her sweater. "I'm ready," she said. Inside the house, I could hear Julian's voice, rising above the clatter of the kitchen, clear grounded and entirely whole. The burden had been set down, the work was done, and the line was ready to continue. Standing amidst the darkness, slowly blanketing the distant Taconic Valley, I smiled faintly upon realizing that those 12,000 lifeless stones outside might have changed hands. Yet Clara's resilient spirit and the ancestral craft, passed down to me, were completely unlost, for they had silently taken deep root within the consciousness of the next generation, transforming the painful vengeance that once tore our flesh and blood apart into a foundation of grace, more unshakable than ever, helping father and son rediscover true peace beneath this very roof. And to you listening to my story, remember this: the hardest battles we fight are often with the people we love most. Looking back, I realize I could have handled things differently with Julian. I could have shown him Clara's notebook the day I found it, saved us both the pain of that lawsuit and the family betrayal, revenge spiral we fell into. But I was hurt that my own son thought I'd steal from him, hurt that 22 months of love and labor meant so little. Don't make my mistake. When family betrayal strikes, don't let pride keep the truth locked away. What I learned through this dad revenge family story is that legacy isn't what you own, it's what you pass on. Julian thought the house was his inheritance, but what really mattered was the craft, the patience, the love of building. When family betrayal revenge consumes you, you miss what's in front of you. I believe God allowed those dark months to teach me that reconciliation doesn't come through courts, but through shared work, teaching my son to feel wood grain and understand what his hands could create. The revenge wasn't selling the house. It was proving love outlasts anger. If this dad revenge family story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced family betrayal? How did you find your way back? Please share this video with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Dad's Sweet Revenge for more stories about healing, legacy, and second chances. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means more to me than you know. One last note. While this story contains fictionalized elements for storytelling purposes, the message about forgiveness craft and what we leave behind is absolutely real.